In the 1970s, when I was growing up, we lived in the Rogue River area. Our house was fairly new at the time. We were on the west side of the Rogue River at the Big Bend there. Our yard ended at a small rise of land that was heavily forested. We were always hearing all kinds of weird animal noises out there, day, night, all the time. Back then it didn't seem like something big because it was just common to us growing up. But now I think back, and it probably was something big. Me and my little brother, who I always called Bub, would play out back in our yard most days. Our parents told us not to leave the yard and to never go into the trees back there, and we didn't. But turns out that things did come down from those trees to see us. I was about 9 when this happened, and my little brother was either 6 or 7 at the time, depending on the time of the summer, if he'd had his birthday, as I remember it. We had turned the hose on, and we were out there making our little mud city. We had our Tonka trucks and earth movers out. We had a large patch of the yard that we had routinely soaked with water just to have our own little mud pit to play in like that. This area was, by my mother's mandate, out in the furthest section of the yard so she didn't have to look at it. One day she pulled the yard hose out in a diagonal away from the house. Where that hose stopped is where our mud pit was allowed to be. I guess 50 feet from the house, or whatever the average hose length was back then in the 1970s. There was still probably the same distance from the mud pit to the trees at the back of the yard. We were doing the mud thing one afternoon when my brother said he needed to go in to use the bathroom. I said okay, thought nothing of it, and went back to planning my little mud city. When he came back out, I heard him walk up to me by the mud pit, but he stopped, and he didn't get down to play. I remember talking to him the whole time, and I'm digging a river through what was going to be my grand little mud city. Whatever I said to him, he either didn't hear or he didn't care to respond to me, because I remember being surprised when he started grabbing the shoulder seam of my shirt and tugging on me to try to get me to stand up. I was still talking when he was doing it. I stopped talking and I looked up at him, but he was looking past me to the trees. I said, "What's up, Bub?" And he whispered, "It's gonna get us. Let's go, now." I remember thinking, what's he talking about? There I was having a great time just smacking the mud all around, plowing my Tonka trucks through the mud. I was covered up to my elbows in mud. I had mud in my underwear from sitting in the mud with my shorts on. And let me say, when you're 9 years old, you know it's a good day when you have mud in your underwear. I was in little boy heaven. So what was his problem, I thought? What is going to get us out here? But Bub just kept looking past me, and I saw that he was starting to breathe hard. And without another word, he whirled and took off and ran back to the house, leaving me sitting there in the mud, wondering what just happened. I finally wise up enough to think, maybe I better look over to where he had been looking. I did. There was nothing there. Being boys like we were, and brothers, well, I guessed he was just punking me. But when he didn't want to come back out and play at the mud pit at all, I wondered what the problem really was with him. He went in and he told Mom and Dad that there was a bear out there and that it had been watching us and that it was going to get us. I was so mad at him for saying that, because now I wasn't allowed to go out and play at my mud pit. I wasn't allowed to go out there at all unless Mom or Dad was with me. But Bub, well, he wouldn't budge. He would not tell them that he was telling a tall story, even though I did everything I could think of to make him say it. Whenever it would come up, he would swear that there had been a big bear standing up about to come over the fence when he came back outside. So I said, "Well, why didn't you yell at me when you came out and you saw it? If you were so scared, why did you come all the way out to the mud pit?" He said that he hadn't seen it until he was almost to the mud pit. He said he saw it because it moved out of the trees, then stopped, and then stepped back to just under the shade of the tree. We went round and round for a week or two about it. I was so mean to Bub. I deliberately broke his toys. I bullied him. I remember I once made myself a bowl of cereal, and then I poured out all the rest of the milk that was in the jug so he couldn't have any. No cereal for him that morning, at least not with milk. Mom didn't understand why there was no milk, but I did. I think he knew what I did, but he didn't see it, so he couldn't rat on me. But I did all kinds of mean things to him like that. Anything I could think of to make him miserable, I did, because I was miserable. It was summertime, and I couldn't even play in my backyard hardly at all because of him and his stupid fantasies. Although, looking back, if I had paid attention to him, I would have seen how terrified he really was. Well, you already know what happened, right? There came that day that I was out there, and I saw it standing in the trees. It was standing as still as a tree. It was so still, and it matched the color of the tree trunk so true, I don't know how I saw it at all. My mom was out there and was sitting up near the house reading a book, and she had a little radio on that she was playing. Bub was doing something playing not far from her up near the house. But I had been out there at the mud pit on my own. I was working to rebuild my grand vision of a mighty mud city with a river running through it, and I was determined to do it by myself if I had to. And that is when I saw it out there in the trees. From memory, here's what I recall it looking like. It was all brown hair colored, the color of a cottonwood tree trunk, oval head shape, forward that seemed to slant backward. The brow seemed pulled down over the eyes, and the eyes seemed small to me, but a very wide mouth. Most of the face was all hair-covered, but I remember that the lips weren't. I recall them seeming like a black line going across the face. It seemed like it wanted me to do something. I remember thinking I was supposed to do something. It wanted me to do something. I was supposed to go to the fence. I was supposed to go over the fence. I was supposed to go over to it. We were going to be friends. Yeah, I was supposed to go to it. I would now say that it was 30 or 40 feet from me. Not to the fence line, but it wasn't back in the trees either. It was still standing there in the shade of the trees. Now, my memory might be faulty after all these years, and we left that property in 1982, so it's been a minute or two since I last saw the real distances between those things. I know, as time goes by, memories are usually all messed up, but I believe that I've had these exact same memories or impressions since the day it happened. They haven't changed at all. Now, I'm not going to guess height. It was just tall. But I was 9 years old then. The mail carrier looked tall to me. At some point or other, I yelled, I screamed, or did something to get my mom's attention, because I start hearing her scream. That much I remember. And I now realize that it had to have happened on a Saturday or a Sunday because my dad was home. When my mom started screaming, she ran into the house to get my dad. Yeah, she left me out there, mind you. She just left me and ran inside. But she went to go get my dad, and the next thing he came out with a baseball bat. I guess he was thinking there was some pervert out there about to steal his little boy or something. I guess my mom didn't say that it wasn't a guy out there. I don't even know what Mom said when she went in. Maybe he just heard her screaming and he grabbed the bat and came running. I don't even think they had guns back then, or bear spray. They might have, but I don't think so. I often wondered what would have happened if it had been a bear. I don't think my dad could have won with it against a bear with a bat. I didn't look back when my mom was yelling. This is where I really think there is truth in them being able to hypnotize or mesmerize you. Because only when I heard my dad did the spell get broken and I was able to look away from it. My dad was coming across the yard and he was roaring like any bear. And then he stopped just a few feet from me. Now I know that he was either very surprised, uncertain, or something, because he stopped and he hesitated and he lowered the bat. Then he came over to me, grabbed me, literally picked me up and threw me over his shoulder and ran with me like I was just a small sack of potatoes. He had never done anything like that. When we got inside, I asked, "What was that?" Mom and Dad both said over and over they didn't know. But it was that kind of moment when parents say stupid lies and kids know they're lying. And that told the 9-year-old me that whatever they were lying about was something either very bad or very adult-only. And I was pretty sure it wasn't the adult-only type of lie. There's a lot more to the story about how I figured it all out and what it was out there, but it's kind of boring. I'll just say there's a reason that I voted for the levy several years ago to build a newer and bigger library where I now live. Libraries, they're the key to the freaking universe. And that's all I have to say about that. It was a while before we went back out there in the yard. And we did see that creature again, but at a lot more distance. I don't ever recall it coming so close again to the house. I do think they are drawn to children. I do think they hypnotize or mesmerize. Because here's the thing that I hadn't told anyone, and the thing that I didn't even realize until I was an adult. At that moment when I was locking eyes with it, I was feeling really okay with it, like we're going to be the best of friends. This is good. And it would really be okay if I just went over the fence to go play with it. I had no fear, and I should have, because I did when I first looked at it. And here is the other thing. While all of that was going on one side of my little tiny head, the other side of my little tiny head was telling me to stop. Don't go near the fence. It's dangerous. It's going to eat you. But guess which side of my little tiny head was going to win the argument? You bet. The side that said, go over the fence, let's play, let's be friends. The adult that I am now, with the memories I have, understands what was going on in that moment. And it makes me shudder because I believe that I narrowly missed becoming one of those kids that you see on a milk carton. I remember that thing's expression. Even from that distance, I remember those eyes and how they just looked at me like I was a lobster in a restaurant aquarium. People don't like me when I talk about this or this aspect of this encounter. And I mean, even people I don't even know. I've been called a liar. I've been called all kinds of things. But Bub remembers it too. My parents remembered it as well. My dad is gone now, and my mom has Alzheimer's. But until the last they could remember, they both remembered it, just like I do. Well, except for the mesmerized bit. Before my dad died, we did talk about it, and he tried those dumb adult lies on me one more time. And I was like, hello, Dad, I'm in my 30s. Stop the lying. Let's get real, Dad. That's what I said. And he did. Dad said that he knew the very second he came out and saw what it was. Well, he knew what it was. He'd heard about them since they had moved into Oregon in the late 60s. But he didn't think that they were something real, or that if they were real, that they would ever come near houses or deliberately near humans. But one summer day in the 1970s, he learned they are real and that they will come very near to houses, and they don't mind coming near humans, not even during daylight. We all also agree that on that day, Bigfoot was looking to kidnap me or Bub. For what purpose? Well, none of us want to speculate, but I doubt that it would have ended well for me. He, too, thinks that it was going to take me or Bub. Dad, that is. Mom thought so, too. We still played out back till we moved, but never without adults there, and for what it's worth, I never completed my big architectural dream of a huge mud city with a mighty river flowing right through the middle of it. And I have no one but Bigfoot to blame. Thank you, Morgan Stahlhaber. This isn't the most incredible encounter ever. It really isn't even a sighting, but we know it was a Bigfoot out there. We were camping on a friend's property that is northeast of Eugene, Oregon. The nearest place to it is a place called Mohawk. I had my daughter, who was 9, and my son, who was 13, with me that weekend. I had taken them camping many years before, but they were both too little to remember. I took them to this friend's land because they weren't quite ready to go deep into a real forest yet. But the land we were on does have real forest all around it. Right out of the gate the first night, we're hearing all kinds of weird noises and calls. I told the kids the most of the worst was what we were hearing, a cougar screaming. But it sounded a little off to me. Because of it, I didn't sleep much that night. The next night, we're hearing all those sounds again, but they sound like they're right outside our tent. The kids were acting a little scared, and really so was I. Then something was walking around, and it was making grunting noises with every step. And it didn't seem like it was just walking around like it was curious or just to be walking around. It seemed deliberate. With every step, there was a pause in between, like it was deliberately letting me hear each stomping noise. It wanted me to know something was out there. And amazingly, it stopped, and we heard it walk away. I didn't know what to think about that. I think the kids finally got some sleep because I told them it was probably just a bear sniffing us out. I tried hard to not let them see that I was worried. I wanted them to have a healthy respect for the land and all of its inhabitants. I did not want them to have a fear of it. Most of my life, I'd been doing things outdoors, and I'd never had anything like this happen, and I was taught early, respect, not fear. I didn't want this early experience to have fear and to color their views from then on about being outdoors. I stayed awake most of that night just to be cautious. I listened to more screams, then another noise that it made that sounded more like it was calling out. It wasn't a screaming sound, not like the night before. This was a deliberate call. There was nothing harsh or shrill like that screaming sound. Near dawn, I was almost asleep when I heard 3 loud whistles. They were very close to the tent. My eyes popped open. Then I heard what sounded like a car door handle, like it was being tried to open. But it was more like when you try to open it and your fingers slip off and the handle slams back down. That sound caught my ear, and now I'm thinking there was one of those crackheads from down the road out there trying to steal stuff. We'd been able to drive the car in quite away from the road, and it was only about 50 feet from us. Now, the night before, we had put everything in there that we weren't using because we were planning to leave pretty early in the morning. So yeah, my friend had warned me about the crackheads down the way. They had a habit of stealing anything they could. So that's what I'm thinking is going on. I'm getting myself out of my bag and I'm slipping on my boots when I hear that stomping or walking sound outside the tent again. About then, it's just getting light enough that I could see shadows outside the tent. And I about crapped myself when I saw it, because it was huge. It was a huge shadow I was seeing out there, and there's no way it could be a man. I was seeing a dark outline of it as it walked around our yellow tent. This outline was walking upright. I wasn't seeing a long or bulky outline on four legs like I would if it was a bear, but I had already figured out what was out there. I am also certain that it was sniffing around the tent, especially where the tent flaps closed. You could hear the sniffing and the exhaling. I think I saw the nylon tent fabric move when it exhaled very near it, like it snorted its breath out right against the nylon on the outside. And even worse, I think I smelled the air that it exhaled. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't like a rotten sewer smell that people talk about. The air it exhaled was like a grassy, musty odor. My son wakes up, and he asks, "What's going on, Dad?" As soon as the Bigfoot out there heard my son's voice, there was a pounding sound as it left the area fast. Then we heard all kinds of whistles all around us. My daughter is waking up too. I calmly tell them, "There's a Bigfoot out there." There's a moment of silence, and my son says, "Really, Dad?" I said, "Yeah, really. I think there's a Bigfoot out there." I did not want to lie to my children. I repeat the information again so they're very clear. My children took it better than I thought they would have. I am not sure that my daughter understood at that time what a Bigfoot really was, but she knows and understands now. Neither of them exhibited fear when I told them, which also surprised me. The whole time, we just waited quietly in the tent before getting out well after daylight started. Once I saw that my kids weren't afraid, I relaxed some. I did have a firearm with me, and I kept it close as we packed up the tent and got out of there. We skipped having breakfast, and we just left when the sun was well up. We had decided breakfast somewhere on the way home out on the road was a much better idea than trying to cook or eat with something like maybe a Bigfoot walking around. My daughter has since told everyone she comes in contact with that we had a Bigfoot out there when we were camping. My son has told a few of his friends, and their reaction, as predicted with teenagers, it's mixed. But my daughter made a big deal out of it in school with everyone who would listen. One day, her teacher contacted me and asked me to please have my daughter stop telling these white lies. I told her it's no lie, and I told her exactly what went down out there that weekend. The teacher repeatedly asked me to please have my daughter at least stop talking about it. It was getting the other kids upset and frightened. And another parent had contacted the teacher about the whole Bigfoot thing because it was frightening her child, and her child said that my daughter was the one doing the frightening by telling her about it. I told the teacher, well, she could stuff it, and so could that other parent. I told her, any more issues, have the parents contact me directly. But I was not going to tell my daughter that she is not allowed to speak the truth because it upset some pearl-clutching mother's child. I don't think I have to say that that phone call did not end well. Now, this happened August 2020. Guess what? My kids are now asking if we can go back there again this year for camping. They're excited about it and have spent all winter learning all they can about Bigfoot. My daughter says it's not scary like they say in the movies and the books. I keep reminding her she doesn't know that for sure, and neither do I. I asked my friend, and I told him what happened. The only thing he said was that his dad had once said that one time he stayed out there and there was something going on, but he passed it off as a bear. If we go out again, and if anything happens, I promise I will get straight home and I'll write an email to you, Nance. I do wish I had seen it, though. Maybe this year. Thanks a lot. Signed, Devin L. I used to write. Now it's been many moons. I drive a semi locally, hauling 53 or so thousand pounds of garbage from Duluth, Minnesota to Superior Landfill 20 minutes away. I live on Fond du Lac Reservation and drive a half hour back and forth. I first saw a Bigfoot when I was 10 years old. My mom and dad would drive us out into the ditch banks. The Army Corps made these ditches 70 or so years ago, and they pass around 3 of our wild rice beds. I saw the Bigfoot take 2 steps across the road, and I've heard and came across his path a handful of times. I'm going to share an encounter I had about 3 years ago. I was playing a game called 10,000 at my sister's with my Uncle Piker, my sister, and her husband. It was after midnight, and I had to get home because I was getting tired. We live in the village with a good house spread apart and trails leading through the wooded areas to get to the house. My uncle dropped me off, and I went to the back of the house. I walked up about 10 steps, and I was walking on the porch to the back door. The edge of the porch where the door is, that was the corner of the house. And there he was, looking in the kitchen window. I just had a back porch light, no light on the side, so I just saw a wide silhouette. Nance, that window's about almost 7.5 feet up, and he was high enough to look in. Only I could see the silhouette looking my way, about, I'd say, 6 feet away. I have been 3 feet in front of one, but I will share that one separately if you'd like to get that. I've had 2 close-up encounters, and I wasn't scared. If I walk through these trails at night, I have more concern, not afraid, but I know he could be out there. I seen small bendable trees across the path that we walk on in daylight. Anyway, back to the story. I went into the house, went into my bedroom that faces the porch, and he walked by, and I kid you not, the window pane creaked. I'm on the upper room, top of the porch height, and the ground sounded like a T-Rex in Jurassic Park. I shut the lights off so he couldn't see me. I took a small bottle rocket and quietly pulled a corner of the curtain back, and I lit that bottle rocket. I blew it towards the trail, which was 50 feet back, and bang! The split second it went off, he started hitting what I think were sticks together, a same 5-hit beat. 40 seconds later, I could still hear a faded 5-beat hit, never missing a beat. The next day, I went out, and I couldn't find a track. I grabbed 2 sticks, and I'm about 5'10" and 250 pounds, and I couldn't hit those sticks together as fast or hard. I used to put out tobacco and burn sweet grass. Now I pray to the Lord, and I burn sage and cedar, 'cause I like the smell anyway. Nance, when you find him, as fascinating and blood-pumping as it is, I don't think you will ever stop listening or looking. Not that you're spooked, but you are in his element. So I'm just saying, when you find Bigfoot, or Big Feet finds you, your life is changed. I moved my bed away from the window after that. I will see you later. There's no goodbye in the First Nations language. Hello to Buckeye Bigfoot and all the listeners. I live in Adams County, almost within sight of the Tranquility State Wildlife Area. I retired in 2007, and then unexpectedly, I lost my wife to cancer not long after. We never saw it coming. So much for the retirement that we had spent years planning together. Long story short, I suddenly didn't like staying in our house alone. We had lived there for 27 years, but it seemed wrong without her there. A couple years before Sheila, that's my wife, passed away, we had bought a 1971 Go tag-along trailer camper. We bought it because it was exactly what we had when we were younger and raising our children and traveling all over the United States. That was a wonderful time of our life. We spent a lot of time and money, and we were restoring it in the hopes of using it to travel all over again, without the kids this time. That was our retirement plan. Well, it wasn't quite done when she died, but I managed to finish it not long after. So instead of me and Sheila rolling around the country with the trailer like we planned, I permanently parked it out back near the pond on my property. Now, it wasn't my plan to begin with, but that year I ended up living in that trailer for 3 out of the 4 seasons. And while I was stuck in the house all winter, I was doodling and sketching and making lists on what I needed to do so that I could live out there for all 4 seasons. And when spring broke, and all through the summer and the fall, I worked like mad to make it happen. And I did. Where the trailer is parked is not someplace a person could casually walk up to and find. I am surrounded by several good neighbors who also have their own parcels of land. And to get where I was, you have to go really far off track. In the 27 years of living on that property, I had never once seen a human there that I had not already invited there, told them where to go, and knew to look for them. Not once did a stranger walk across my property. So, I wasn't in the habit of locking my trailer door. In 2010, I had walked up to the house with a duffel bag full of clothes to do the laundry. I was there a couple of hours in the house doing the laundry and going through the mail and all the normal things I tried to do while I was there. I tried for just a little bit to be a responsible adult again. It was late afternoon when I packed my bag with my clean laundry and decided it was time to run away from home again and headed back out to my trailer. I had said 1,000,000 times I needed to get a golf cart to go back and forth. I wasn't so young anymore. And that is what I was thinking about when I came around to the trailer by the pond. Imagine my shock when I saw the camper door had been swung open and all the things outside were in disarray. I had a small grill out there, a small table and chairs, and all of that had been clearly moved. My pop-up tent had been knocked over, and the string of plastic lanterns that had ringed my pop-up tent were torn down. The hair stood up all over me. I stopped and listened. I wasn't sure if whoever had done this was still there. They might be in the trailer. I thought I could be walking up on someone or someones who are very dangerous. I mean, in this world, you just don't know anymore, do you? But there was nothing to hear. I set my laundry duffel down. I had no weapons on me. I walked up to the trailer cautiously, listening every few steps. Whoever had been there was gone. I thought maybe they saw me coming before I saw them because I was lost in thought. And maybe because it didn't look like anything inside the trailer had been touched, maybe they had left. Maybe they just opened the door when they saw me coming, and then they left. That was the best I could make of it. I was so focused on looking around and looking inside the trailer and listening to see if anyone still might be there that I never looked down for prints. It was only when I went into the trailer and was coming back out that I saw the clear prints in the dirt. I first took them to maybe be bear prints all stepped over each other. I'm not a tracker or a hunter, so I was just guessing. Now, I had heard that we had bears in Adams County and that they had been a problem quite a bit, but I was overly confident because in all that time I had never seen one on my land. I believed that that's what it was. That's what had flung open the door because I hadn't locked it and it had destroyed everything out there. But from then on, I was extra cautious. I took to carrying my dad's old .44 every time I stepped out of that trailer. I did not want to step out and have a bear come around the trailer and I have no defense. Now, it might not take that bear down in one shot, but I prayed it would give me a fighting chance. Now, it's getting down further into the summer, and it's hot as blazes out there. It was dry, and the pond was visibly shrinking day by day. Now, this was dangerous for a lot of the animals out there, because more than once I had already had to rescue some helpless animal who had tried to go down to the bank to get a drink of water, only to find some of it was muddy, some of it was too steep, and they would fall in, and they just couldn't paw their way back out. It had become my habit every morning, several times during the day, and the last thing before the sun went down at night, to scan the pond carefully for any animals struggling. To keep myself busy, I carved various Appalachian-type items to sell. I was carving a wooden dough bowl while sitting under the pop-up tent out there. At some point, something told me I better look up, and I did. I squinted. I looked around, and I didn't see anything out there at first. Then I saw something at the far end of the pond. Now, this pond is oval-shaped. It's about 150 feet long and 100 to 110 feet wide at the widest point. What caught my eye was right at the farthest point away from me, right at the top of the pond's point of the oval. What I saw was a muddy brown color. It was a big lump that blended with the exposed pond bank. It took me several seconds of looking at it to realize I was looking at an animal. It was on squatted down haunches, like it was going to dip water out of the pond, which I thought it couldn't possibly do because the water level was so low. I turned to act like I was going back to work on my wood carving, but I was doing that thing where you are really watching something from the side of your eye. But unless someone is really close to you, they would think you're looking a different way because the way your head is turned. I don't know if that makes sense. So, I'm looking at this thing from the corner of my eye, and I don't know why. I just wanted to wait and see what would happen. I was having strange thoughts right then. There was no question what I had seen. I knew what it was. I was curious, frightened, and numbly shocked all at the same time. I wanted to run and hide in the trailer, and yet I also wanted to wait and see what it was going to do. If it looked like it was going to come closer to me, I was heading straight inside. Now, if it just wanted some water and was going to leave, well, that's no problem, is it? I thought it was impossible, but I didn't see how long its arms were at first, because it leaned forward while it was squatting, reached down with an arm, and cupped a handful of water from the very low pond and drank. and it balanced perfectly while it did that. It drank a total of 3 handfuls of water. Then it sat back, squatted, and looked at me for a while. I know it was looking right at me. When it sat back, it had gone down on its butt and wrapped its arms around itself. But its head and its body, they were pointing right at me. Apparently, we were both playing this wait-and-see game, I think. Well, it gave up first and stood up. And that was when any doubt that I might have had, which, by the way, let me say, I didn't have any doubts. I already knew what it was. But if there had been any doubt about what I was seeing, that is when they all left me. Even from as far away as I was from it, I could see it was tall, and not just tall, it was a giant. I don't know how such a big animal could possibly fold itself up to be so small like it was when it was squatted and sitting. When it was squatted down and had wrapped itself up, it might have only been a couple feet high. Standing, it was over 8 feet. I gauged that from having my son stand there later the next day while I was at the same place at the trailer. What I saw stood 3, maybe 4 heads higher than my son, who was right at 6 feet tall. My son also looked very small and thin at that distance by comparison. When it stood up, it kept looking my way for 2 or 3 more seconds. Then it went away into the trees over on that side of the pond. As soon as it was out of my sight, I got up and ran into the trailer and shut the door. I didn't think that it was going to come after me. I didn't see anything threatening from it. But the fact was, I was out there alone with no one within shouting distance to hear me if there was trouble. I had no self-defense with me, and out there was a creature that I was pretty sure was a Bigfoot, and it was just a few 100 feet away from me, maybe even closer than that by now, depending on where it went once it got into the trees. I knew very little about the creature known as Bigfoot, except to identify it if I happened to run across one. I kept checking out of all the little windows all around the trailer, but it didn't come near the trailer that I ever saw. Right then, I wondered, is this who or what opened the trailer door that day? Yes, it's strange to think about it, but I'm unable to let go of the notion even to this day. There had never been anyone out there before, and since then no one has ever been out there. So over 37 years I have been on this property, and never has anyone trespassed on my land. But within a week of that happening, I see a Bigfoot? Is that just too much coincidence? What do you think? Now, I almost went back to the house to spend the night. I thought maybe I'd be safer in a sturdy house than out here in this little tiny tin can trailer. But I also knew the old saying about falling off a horse was very true. And while this wasn't a fall from a horse that I needed to get back up on real quick, something told me that if I didn't stay out there in my trailer that night, I would never stay all night out there again. So I steadied my nerves, calmed myself, and quietly spent the night out there. And it was a dull night, let me say. Lots of frogs making lots of noises mostly. Sleep came very hard, and when it came, there wasn't much of it. Every noise I heard, I was up and looking out a window. I told myself over and over, I was just hearing the same noises that I'd been hearing for years, and I did try to get some sleep. I did call my son within an hour of the sighting that afternoon. I didn't know what else to do. He lived in Blanchester. I knew my closer son was away at work. So I called my younger son in Blanchester, and he said that he was going to come right out. But I told him not to. I said it would be long dark before he got there, and I was already settling in for the night. We spent a lot of time talking about what we knew of Bigfoot. My son got on his computer and was looking everything up. Back then, in 2010, I had an LG Envy phone. It was a good phone for the time, but it wasn't the kind of phone that you surf the internet on, especially not out where I was. Now, I could get hotspots out there. I got reception out there, but I wasn't going to eat up that kind of data for the internet surfing on that old phone. My son and I concluded that I probably wasn't going to die by a Bigfoot that night. Other than the story about the miners 100 years ago where one was killed by a Bigfoot, we didn't really find any stories that said a Bigfoot was known to have killed someone. Well, not that day anyway, not in that first quick search. So all of that helped me shape my decision to stay there that night. Truth was, I would have felt better with my son there with me. I trust my boys with my very life, and I don't like to brag, but I raised some fine men, y'all. Anyway, recap. I found the trailer door open one day, things moved around and destroyed. Then I see a Bigfoot out by the pond. Okay, that's where we're at right now. I'll try to keep this moving along here. Sorry. The next thing that happened early one morning just a couple weeks later. I had already been up to the house, went out to the drive, got the paper, and had made my single-press cup of coffee back at the trailer. I took my coffee mug and set it and the newspaper outside on the table. Now, let me stop here and just say something. Until just a few weeks prior, I was not in the habit of carrying a gun out there on my land. I had never needed a holster of any sort to carry it. I didn't have to think about it at all. The gun I was carrying was a Ruger Super Black Hawk 44 mag with long barrel. It had been my father's. I believe he got it in the 1960s or 1970s. I inherited it and the leather belt for it after he passed away. The belt holster was very heavy and very uncomfortable for me to wear, especially when sitting down. So I typically didn't use the holster. When I was outside, I always put the gun by itself within reach from wherever I was, or when I was walking, as in up to the house, I would simply carry it in my hand. Now, you might be wondering why. Well, fact is, I never needed to work out the logistics of keeping a gun handy or wearing one in my entire life. So, that was my solution for the time being. I had to stop and explain this so you understand why I panicked here in just a few moments. It was about 8 a.m., I think. I had set my coffee cup down, then set the newspaper down, and then I placed the gun on the table as well. I was just sitting, and my butt hadn't set all the way down into the chair when I heard my cell phone go off inside the trailer. I picked up my gun, and I set it on top of the newspaper that was folded over so it wouldn't blow away. I go inside the trailer and answer my phone. It's my son. We're talking all about the dates where he wants to come and stay that summer with him and all of his kids during his time of custody for the summer. So instead of walking straight back outside with the phone, I'm standing inside the trailer looking at the tiny little calendar. As I'm talking, I turn around to look for a pen to start marking dates. And then, that's when I almost had a heart attack. There it was, a Bigfoot looking right inside the trailer. He's bent down, and he's looking in right at me. We are almost eye level, with 2.5, maybe 3 feet between our noses. My son said, I yelled out, "Oh, Jesus God!" and I dropped or threw the phone. I don't remember that. I remember my first thought was that the camper door was open and that my 44 was sitting outside on the table with my coffee and newspaper. I'm doing all these mental gymnastics on whether or not I could get outside, get the gun, and get back inside and close the door before that thing could come around to the front of the trailer. My mind said, "Oh no, buddy. Nope, 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 nope." Now, while earlier we hadn't found much info on Bigfoot killing anyone, that first day I mean, My son and I had since read up and found all kinds of native cultures that say they are cannibals and that when they start coming right up to where you live, you're in danger. Now, if my son had read me that info that very first night that I first saw a Bigfoot and called him, well, I don't think I would have stayed out there that night. My son and I disagreed about how close was coming close to where I lived if we followed the native belief. My son was adamant that even a couple 100 feet out by the pond was too close. I countered and said, well, it was just getting water. It didn't have any choice but to come that close. My son countered again that Bigfoot is what probably tore through the area that day, opened my trailer door, and then he stressed the opening, the door part. Did I understand what that meant? Yes, son, I got it. And so that is how we found you, Buckeye Bigfoot. We are still reading all we can, even though all of these incidents are more than 10 years gone. There was a story headline that you had that said something about Bigfoot can open doors. That caught my eye, and that got me to listen. And yes, I do believe some of them are every bit intelligent enough to open doors, no matter thumb latch, whether it's a doorknob or lever handle. I think they're smart enough to figure it out. I'm sorry, I'm getting off track again. It happens a lot when you get older. I keep writing things down in this email, then I walk away, and then I come back, and I get all off track. My face and that Bigfoot's ugly face were just a few feet away from each other. And I do mean it was an ugly face. The one that Roger Patterson filmed, that one is a downright superstar beauty queen in comparison to the one that was standing outside my trailer that day. Now, when it was out by the pond, I couldn't see the facial features from that distance. But up close like this, let me assure you, he is one ugly creature. And it had a malevolent look to it as well. You know, the way you can look at some dogs, and even though they aren't making a sound or growling or barking, you just know they're thinking about where's the juiciest part of you they want to bite first. There, that's what he looked like at me. I noticed that there wasn't much hair on his face, and the face looked leathery and dry, like dark brown mud baked in the sun. The hair started below its lips and got thicker around the neck and on down. The hair also started at the brow ridge and got thicker going up. But the face was hairless otherwise, and it made it very clear to read its expression. The eyes were light brown with a red hint to them. If you can call an eye color auburn, let's do that. Let's call its eyes auburn. They were a different brown than its skin or fur, which was muddy and dull and dirty looking, and I mean the color. The eyes, in comparison, were bright and the color clear. The nose looked like a flattened human's nose with a bulbous end that flared into frilled nostrils. I had a surreal second where everything seemed suspended, and I was hyper-aware of looking at those frills on his nostrils just moving as it breathed. Even the face seemed strong and oversized. I'm not sure how long we looked at each other like that. Might have only been a half second. Might have been 10 seconds. I really couldn't tell you. Just like the time before when it was out at the end of the pond, it decided to break the stalemate first. When it turned to move away from the window, I knew immediately it was coming around to the front of the trailer. And I don't mind telling you, I was hyperventilating. I was having a heart attack. My body hair was rising up all over me. My stomach was churning. I was about to get sick, and cold sweat broke out all over me. That all happened at once in a flash. All of it happened in a split fraction of a second. I think I might have delayed for a microsecond before I knew I had to get into action and I had to close that door. Now, the door had swung open all the way against the side of the trailer when I opened it earlier to come in to get my phone. So to close it, I had to go stand in the doorway, lean out, reach around to get the door to close it. In other words, I had to fully expose my entire body just to close that door. I had my hand on the door, and I was pulling it closed when I saw a massive brown coming around the far end of the trailer. I leaned back and I pulled that door shut with a slam and switched the little lock. Now I know that that lock was probably as successful as a sheet of aluminum foil protecting you from hot lava, but it was all I had. And I swear, by all the gods, holy, unholy, real, imagined, I swear that that thing outside tried to work the doorknob to open it. Again, my son says that I was screaming and cursing at it, telling it to go away, and screaming all kinds of things. He said he could hear all of it through the phone that I had thrown down. I have no memory of saying anything. I only remember being terrified that it was going to tear that door open and pull me out of that trailer. I was pulling so hard on my side of the door to keep it closed. It's a wonder I didn't tear it off and pull it inwards. Now, I'm not trying to say that Bigfoot was out there trying to tear the door off the trailer. He wasn't. It did rattle the door and the doorknob. It understood how to open the door. It understood the doorknob mechanism. And that was the sheer terror for me when I realized that. Now, my son says all of this didn't go on for too long before I picked up the phone and told him to get his butt over there and to bring his rifle. He had already heard about the initial Bigfoot incident from both me and his brother. And while his brother lived out in Batavia, he actually lived less than 2 miles from me. Now, he told me to calm down. He was coming right over. He also told me that I needed to call the sheriff. I said no. I already knew how people would get treated and labeled around there. I made him stay on the phone with me the whole time while he drove to my house. What it was that made me stop in my panic and terror and pick up the phone was that I had watched it stop bothering the door, and I watched it go past the window and walk toward the pond. That is when I had the presence of mind to pick up the phone, and I could hear my son squawking on the other end, yelling for me. When I told my son everything, I was watching it walk to the far side of the pond. I watched as it walked down the length of the pond, and it headed back into the same cluster of trees that it had went into previously when I saw it before. Only this time, it reached the tree line, stopped, and it turned and it looked at me for just a few seconds. Now, I don't know if it could actually see me standing inside the trailer through the window, but it looked toward the trailer. My hair stood up all over again. When my son finally got there were plenty of tracks everywhere to be seen. None of them clear, though, none of them distinct. I was so panicked that all I wanted to do was go around and cover them all up. I just wanted to make them go away. Also, by the time he got there, I had started to feel really foolish. I don't know. Dads are not supposed to ask their sons for help. We're supposed to be the ones doing the helping, right? That's how it's supposed to go. I felt like a fool, and I felt like I looked weak in front of my sons. Now, they told me that's not how they saw me, but it sure was how I felt at that moment. And within an hour or so, my other son got there as well, the one from Batavia. Altogether, we did a light scouting inside the trees back there. And other than some well-worn paths that could have been game trails, there was nothing to be seen. Just one problem, though, according to my younger son. See, I was never a hunter, and neither was his brother. None of my family ever was. But my youngest son, he married into a family of avid hunters, and he took to it with great zeal and gusto. Now, my son pointed out to me that what we were looking at weren't just game trails. He pointed out what he called the natural foliage turnaway. Now that happens when animals use a trail and the brush and the bushes along it get brushed so often they learn to grow away from that area. Now you've probably seen it a lot and you don't even realize it. When you drive down busy streets that have trees, even though no one's been trimming bushes or trees back, they don't grow into the busy roadways. Now, above average truck height, you'll see those trees start to arch over, but not below truck height. Now that is what my son noticed. A busy, well-used path with very clear foliage turnaway that went up to about 8 feet high. As far as we dared to follow it, it was 8 feet high all the way. Now, bucks with big antlers, even as high as they might go, can't make it 8 feet high. There's nothing out there in those trees that we know of that could possibly do that. But the fact remained that something was out there doing that. So I just reread this email after taking some time to think about it. This all seems so very dramatic, and when I lived through it, it really was dramatic to me. But I want to stress that Bigfoot was not tearing down the doors. He was not attacking me, I don't think. But my mind and my survival mode reacted as if he was. I realize it now more than ever, just writing all of this out. I feel all those panic modes and emotions all over again. So, sorry to go back and forth and getting off track. Now, you're wondering what happened, I know. Well, I'll tell you. Nothing. Nothing happened. That thing might still be out there in those trees. I don't know. I finally came to the conclusion that it was high time that I stopped running away from home, of running away from a house that seemed too empty without my dear Sheila in it, and I needed to go home. Now, Bigfoot wasn't the only reason I decided this. I also decided I was never going to roll around the countryside by myself with that old tag-along trailer, and I resold it. You see, that was our dream, mine and Sheila's. We were going to relive our youth with the same camper we had that we had fun with our kids. We were going to go to all the places that we couldn't afford to even park at when we were young and raising children. That was to be our retirement. But fate had other ideas, and it just seemed wrong to try to keep living it out in my backyard alone. It all seemed foolish. Well, I let it all go. I've learned to deal with it. I've learned to deal with this loss. I do still go out there to the pond area a lot. We have had campouts and bonfires and overnight stays when all the kids and grandkids come out during the summer. But we men, we are all on our toes. But never have we seen anything more, and we haven't heard anything either. However, one neighbor has reported quite a few odd disturbances, but I don't know all the particulars or the ins or outs. Now, I am the only one that saw it. My boys, thankfully, believe me. I can't imagine not being believed by my family. I have heard and read that happens all too often, and I am so sorry for those people, and I feel guilty, but yet thankful that is not my story. Now, I have read a lot about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, all of that since then, and I still have no better idea about it or any better way to understand or explain its behaviors or what its motives were, what triggered it, if anything. I was always extra careful about any food issue out there because Adams County had a black bear issue. I was always careful to never feed wildlife of any kind, and other than rescuing some who were about to drown in the pond. My creed was to not interfere with anything living out there. I tried to live lightly out there and not be a disturbance. I'm a quiet man by nature. I didn't sit out there and listen to loud radios all night or sit out and get drunk. I wasn't out there doing wood knockings, whooping, or any of that. Truthfully, most nights I sat around and I listened to the frogs and worked on a carving and shooed the raccoons and possums on their way, and then I would turn out the lights and quietly go to sleep. Maybe it was the heat and the lack of rain, although that was not an especially drought-stricken year. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe the natives are right. Those things test you, and they keep coming closer and closer and let you get comfortable with them, and then they catch you off guard, and that's when they take you. I really don't know. Well, thank you for letting me tell this. Signed, David. I thought I would share an experience I had today. We were camping in the Everglades at the Flamingo Campground. We decided to hike a nearby trail. The trail itself was about 45 minutes one way. It was my husband, me, and my 10-year-old son. About 3/4 of the way, we heard 2 loud wood knocks. I picked up a fallen branch and did a knock back. Crickets. No more knocks. We continued on and finished the trail, which ended at a body of water. Around a creek connected to the body of water, we observed footprints deep in the mud. The prints went up and down the creek and disappeared into the swamp. I wouldn't say they were particularly large, about the size you would expect from a man. You could clearly see the toe imprints. This definitely made me suspicious, but you never know in Florida. There are Florida man adventures around every day. We started the walk back down the trail. Near the same area of the trail we heard a knock previously, we now heard a weird hoot sound, like an owl, but not an owl. It's hard to explain. I asked my husband if he heard that. He said yes, but kept shrugging everything off when I pointed it out. My son, on the other hand, was getting scared and rushing us to hurry along. After 5 more minutes of walking, I heard a grunt sound come from the right side of the trail, opposite the side where the owl sound and wood knock came from. My son heard it and grabbed onto my side and told me he was scared and didn't like this trail one bit. After 10 minutes of walking, I thought, okay, we are good now. Haven't heard anything for a bit. Then suddenly we came across a horrible smell, like a skunk and sewage. It smelled terrible. I felt at that moment we were being watched. I was really scared at any moment a skunk ape was going to jump out of the trees and reveal itself. Thank God that is not what happened. We picked up our steps and finally made it back to the main road where our car was waiting. Even as we backed up and drove away, I felt like we were being watched. I don't think I will walk here again. We walked this trail in the morning around 9:30 a.m. I would like to add that we had walked this same trail just a couple of months ago and didn't experience anything out of the normal that time. I lived in Tomahawk, Wisconsin from 1994 to 1999. A lot of strange things happened while living there. One of the first things that I remembered, I think it was 1995. There was a loud slap on the side of the house. What the heck was that, I wondered. See, at that time, I was not a believer in Bigfoot, not until I started hearing these stories years later. My wife and I were over-the-road truckers. We were gone for weeks at a time and only spent a few days there. When I bought the place, there was 1 3/4 acres of land with it. I went to the back of that land. There was a teepee that was built. I thought it was the strangest thing. I contributed to kids maybe playing out in the woods. One night, my wife said something was trying to get in the front door. But the front door was never used. It was swollen shut and real hard to open. Every time I came home after being out on the road, there would be branches ripped off the trees all over the yard. One day, I'm down by the edge of the road, planting flowers around the mailbox, and a rock landed next to me. I looked around. I cannot see where it came from. I thought my wife was playing games with me. I asked her if she threw a rock at me, and she said no. I like grilling out. One night, I was grilling out brats and took off the ones that I wanted and left more on the grill and shut it off. I went out to get them, and they were gone. Came home after being out on the road for a few weeks, and my roof was full of stones again. I thought it was weird. I had a burning barrel where I burned the garbage to make sure bears and other creatures would not get into it. It smelled like rotten meat, and I thought I left something in the burning barrel. I could find nothing. Used to hear knocking, but I thought it was a woodpecker. At sundown, heard screaming in the woods, but it sounded like a bobcat to me. I was laying in bed one night. There was a window that was in the bedroom, and in my mind's eye, I could see this creature standing on the side of the wall by the house. It was large and hairy. It looked like a large werewolf. I thought I was imagining things. My wife and I were out looking for real secluded spots to build another house, and we ran across this lean-to that was 4 feet high out on this logging road. I thought, what the heck? Who would do something like this in the middle of nowhere? I was blind, like a lot of people are. They don't understand until they have heard the stories, and then they realize what just happened. Signed, Gary. In 1999, I was transitioning to UCLA. After getting settled where I would be living, I still had a few weeks before fall classes started, so I headed north to visit a friend in Oregon. I stayed with him a few days before I had him drive me over to Crater Lake. He wasn't at all sure to just let me get out and leave me there, but I told him I was going to be fine. I had supplies for over a week, and I was a seasoned hiker and camper, which he knew. I told him that I would call when I hiked out and ask for a pickup then. I told him I didn't know exactly where I'd be when I did that, but I expected it would be 5 to 7 days from that day. I spent 2 days near Crater Lake. Then I caught a ride with a man heading west on Crater Lake Highway. Now this was all good, but at the split near Diamond Highway, he was going north. I did not want to go north, so he let me out right there. I hiked south further down Crater Lake Highway, and I came upon a scenic place called Natural Bridge. This is a place where the Rogue River actually goes underground in like a natural tunnel for a stretch. It's really neat to look at. I took some time looking at the site, and then I headed west again, roughly following the right bank of the Rogue River. I came to a point where the Rogue River turned south. I continued on west. I crossed one forest road and kept going up to cross over a ridge. On down the slope on the other side, I crossed another forest road. I was still heading due west. Not long after, my slight rain that had started about 20 minutes earlier became a downpour, and it was raining so heavily it was hard to see and getting dangerous. It was also getting to be nightfall. I decided that was the time to stop. I found a suitable area to set up for the night and quickly settled in under my tarp. When you sleep in the forest at night, you will hear all kinds of things, and I was accustomed to that. I have never slept well in the forest, but I love it out there enough during the day that it's worth whatever night discomfort I might suffer. The rain made it very hard to hear, and that made me uneasy. So I was awake through most of the downpour, and I was able to make sure that everything stayed as dry as possible. I had a headlamp strapped on, and I was turning it on and off from time to time as I was checking and rearranging things to make sure nothing was getting wet as the wind and the rain changed. When I wasn't actively doing something, I kept the headlamp turned off. When the downpour stopped, it was just after 3:30 a.m. on my watch. When it stopped, I turned my headlamp on, got out, rearranged my tarp, checked all my things, and then turned my headlamp off, crawled under my tarp, and went down to sleep. But my eyes hadn't been closed long when I heard something either walking very fast or slowly running. I didn't know which. But I knew it was big. It made a lot of noise, and it was coming right at me. It was coming down from the ridge area that I had crossed earlier the night. I was perplexed because what I heard didn't sound like any of the large animals that I'm accustomed to hearing in the forest. And despite being rather large, most of the bears that I've encountered in the wild have actually been very quiet. I've only heard the occasional branch snap if a bear steps right on it. That, I think, is how bears and humans often get tangled up. Humans don't hear the bears until they're almost right on top of them. I've also heard bears charging, and there's a distinct pattern to their feet pounding. This was not that. It was not a four-footed pounding sound. But what I heard was coming toward me faster than some odd animal out there just walking around. I turned my headlamp back on. I got out from the tarp and scanned around. When I turned it on, the sound immediately stopped. No more direction coming toward me. I turned to that direction that I had heard it coming from. Now my headlamp didn't light up a great big area in front of me, and all I saw was trees. I got back under my tarp, shaking my head after just a few minutes of waiting and looking. I turned off my headlamp. I thought, well, that was weird. But I had an uneasy feeling, though. It had been a long day. I'd done a lot of heavy hiking, and I was physically dead tired. And even though things felt weird, I was falling asleep. But I came wide awake because I heard something right outside my tarp. That scared me because I hadn't heard it walk up to the tarp, so it had come up very quietly, on purpose. It had to. Now, I don't know what it was doing. I didn't have anything out there. Everything I had was under the tarp with me because I thought it might rain again. But it was walking around where I had the tarp strung between two trees. With everything wet out there, you could hear each step. It was very quiet. I think it was trying to be quiet deliberately. At that second, I thought maybe it was a person, because animals don't usually care about deliberately being quiet. Most animals smell a human, and they go out of their way to go the other way. I considered looking out from under the tarp, and I decided not to. I had a large knife, but otherwise I was defenseless. I stayed quiet, and I listened hard enough that my ears were ringing. Something brushed or touched the tarp. The suspension line between the trees creaked, and there was the sound of something rubbing or moving the tarp. It was a rustling sound. I felt the air rush in and out from under my tarp as the suspension line was picked up and allowed to drop a few times, carrying the tarp with it. I imagined it was a big bear out there, and it was chewing or nipping on the nylon rope, raising it and letting it go. I just couldn't think of anything else. I was terrified. No, wait, that is an understatement. I can't think of a word to tell you what I was thinking or feeling. The tarp was touched or moved again, and then it hit me, a strong, wet dog smell. Now that could have been from any animal out there with all the rain we had. But I was almost relieved because it told me that it was an animal and not a person to have that kind of smell. I was still hoping that it was maybe a person who had seen my headlamp from a distance in the night. Maybe they were in need of help, or maybe they were lost. But since no one ever called out, as I think anyone lost would have done if they had seen a light in the darkness, I decided it probably wasn't a person out there. The wet dog smell told me it had fur. So yeah, it was probably a bear. This absolutely terrified me beyond words. I could not win against a bear at close range with only a knife. I don't think I could have with anything short than a major rifle. To move or say anything might provoke it. The tarp was no protection, as I was sure it would eventually nose under it, and then I was done for. No way I could get out of the tarp or outrun it. I had no options but to wait, hope, and pray it would get bored and go away. I had my knife out. I decided if it nosed under the tarp, I would do my best to inflict mortal wounds upon it as it would me right before it killed me. Those were the longest minutes of my life, and yes, they were just a couple of minutes. There was a chill in the air after the rain, but I could feel sweat rolling down my face, tickling my cheeks and my neck. But I was too terrified to move to wipe them away. To the west, there was another forest road. I knew it was there, but I did not realize how close I was to it when I had stopped that night. Someone now was coming down the road in a car. I could just see a hint of headlights under the edge of the tarp. Now this was roughly 100 feet from my position, I would guess. I heard the vehicle before I saw the lights, and what I saw was just a very faint line of light just under the edge of my tarp. But at the sound of that car, and at the sight of the lights, whatever or whoever was outside my tarp started running away. No, not away, running toward the car on the road. I sat still and I held my breath. I didn't want to draw it back to me. I hope it chased the car for miles. After a while, I could see that it was getting to be blue out from under the edge of the tarp. That was a very long time while I sat there huddled, waiting, gripping my knife. It was 4:50 a.m. when I got out from under my tarp. It was blue dawn all around me. I took a careful look around, just to be sure, and I was alone. But I had not been alone. That was very clear. Even though I could see all around in the blue dawn, I turned on my headlamp to look and see if I could make out tracks, to see what had been there. The prints were very distinct because of the recent rain. I was fully prepared to see maybe big bear paws, but that's not what I saw. What I saw looked like oversized, bare human footprints. My size 10 hiking boot looked child-sized when placed next to those prints. I didn't have any way to measure, so I pulled a dollar bill from my pocket. I put my hiking boot next to the print and then laid the dollar bill at the tip of my boot toe. That dollar bill was only a bit past the footprint. I then laid that dollar bill in the print, then flipped it on its side so it was lying next to where it had been, so I got an idea of the width. So, $2 bills fit inside the print at the most narrow part with just a little spare room on either side. That was all the time that I took on those prints. I had seen enough. I knew what made those prints. I packed up and I got out of there. I hiked the couple miles back out to Crater Lake Highway. I went south and found a little roadside place that let me use their phone. I called my friend and asked him to pick me up, and he did so that afternoon. I was done hiking. My friend asked me when he picked me up why I had called it quits so early, because he knew I loved hiking, and I was very hyped up about it before going. I just told him that all the rain the night before made it a muddy mess. He never questioned me because he didn't hike. Never have I had anything like that happen. I have not been back to that area since. I did not know at the time that it was a Bigfoot hotspot. I did not pay attention to such things, but I do pay attention now. I wish I had seen it, but I am also glad I did not. I am far more careful about where I hike now. I am always better armed, and I am never alone now when I go in the forest. I was not hurt. Nothing was taken. It was the headlamp, I think, that made it come to me, and it was the car headlights that made it run to the road. I don't know. Maybe it's attracted to lights. Maybe it thinks the lights in the darkness is a game like a cat with a red laser light. Also, I've been asked, did I hear yells or talking or whoops? I heard nothing like that before or after. I only heard movement and something brushing and moving my tarp. That's it. If I hadn't seen the clear footprints, I would have thought it was a curious bear and that I had just narrowly escaped being its midnight Scooby snack. Also, about the dollar bill thing. I measured the dollar bill when I got home. Turns out a United States dollar bill is just over 6 inches long and about 2 5/8 inches wide. Now, my size 10 boot measured just at 11 inches, so that meant the print was right at 17 inches long and about 5.5 inches wide. Now, for my overseas listeners, by the way, I did a conversion. That's about 43 centimeters long and about 14 centimeters wide for that footprint. Thanks for listening. Might not seem scary, but it was to me that night. Signed, Brendan Doyle. Dear Nance, this is a short happening that I had one November in 2020 in the morning. It was 4 a.m. I was leaving out for work. I remember opening the front door and going down the steps and walking the sidewalk to my truck. It was about 50 degrees and the sky was clear. I got in my truck and started to back out of the driveway when I remembered I didn't get my phone. I stopped my truck and got out. I walked back into the house to get my phone. When I came back out of the house, I noticed a strong, musky odor that I had never smelled before. I slowly walked to my truck when I heard these weird, chattering voices that I couldn't understand. It sounded like what they call samurai chatter. It was like two Bigfoot were talking to each other. One was about what sounded to be 200 feet in front to my left, and the other in front to my right, about 80 to 100 feet away. I honestly have to say I was scared. I quickly got in my truck and I left for work. Now, every morning when I leave, I look around everywhere before I get in my truck. I live in Taylorsville, North Carolina. You can use my name and location. Thanks. Signed, Dan H. The following is a series of encounters had by one woman named Jeanae. Encounter number 1, Roanoke, Virginia, summer 1995. I was visiting my family's rural property. The creature that I encountered was black, with an acorn-shaped head, flat nose, and big, long-fanged teeth. It smelled putrid. It burst into our cabin without warning. We didn't know what it was and hid. It tore the interior of the cabin apart and threw a burning log from the fireplace out a window. Then it ran off. Encounter number 2. Topeka, Kansas, Summer Camp, 1997. I was already very frightened by the first encounter. After 2 weeks at camp, all of us kids were asleep one night when there was a bang and whooping outside the cabin door. The door was then torn from the hinges. All the kids woke up and were screaming in terror for hours. The creature appeared to be a juvenile, approximately 5 feet tall and reddish-brown. It had an awful smell, like a combination of decomposition, skunk, and fish. Its head reminded me of an acorn with a wide nose and yellow eyes. Encounter number 3. Adirondack Mountains, New York, spring, 1999. Halfway up my friend's driveway, a 10-foot-tall black figure with claws ran in front of our car and stopped. It stared at us and became increasingly agitated. It had a dog-like head, a long snout, small mouth, and ghostly black eyes, like Dogman. My uncle honked the horn. It didn't move, but swiped at the hood. We sped away from it. It chased us with 2 great steps and an ear-shattering yell. The last we knew, it ran into the woods with 3 swift jumps, and then we heard tree knocks and rocks being thrown. We did not see it again. Encounter number 4, Tupelo, Mississippi, summer 2000, 4 a.m. Very rural location with no houses nearby for miles. We were in an RV and stepped outside. As my mom came to the side of the RV, a rock the size of her head flew by and broke a small tree trunk in half. A 10-foot-tall, silver-white creature charged into the road, crossed it in 3 leaps, ran into a cornfield, and began howling. Encounter number 5, Louisville, Kentucky, winter 2002. A group of us on a class trip were in 3 buses going to a ski resort on a snowy, bitterly cold day. We were driving up a long hill. 3 8-foot-tall black creatures appeared and ran along with the first bus. One of them jumped on the first bus door and began violently shaking it, trying to get in. A few of the students ran and held the door latch, preventing it from getting in the bus. The other 2 creatures each shook a bus like they were made of rubber until they realized they were not able to stop or enter the vehicles. Then all 3 creatures ran toward a cliff and disappeared. When we reached the ski lodge, the staff had numerous encounter stories to share. When we left, they arranged for fire trucks to escort us back down the hill. Encounter number 6, Spokane, Washington, summer 2005. We were driving when suddenly a big tree fell right in front of us. A 10-foot-tall brown creature with yellow eyes and a human-like face crashed through the trees, growled at us, and took off into the woods with 3 strides. As it growled, there was a stillness around us. No movements or sounds, just deathly quiet and stillness. It cleared a path through the woods for about 2 minutes, then turned back to stare at us, and then kept going. We quickly moved the tree and hauled out of there. Encounter number 7, Milwaukee, Washington, summer 2007. We were driving through the woods on a hot, sunny day and stopped for a quick nature call. When we returned to the car, a 9-foot-tall creature crashed through the woods, chasing a deer and a skunk. It caught the deer, actually snapped it into 2 pieces, threw it over its shoulder, and ran back into the woods. We left quickly. My parents bought 20 acres of land in Adams County, Ohio, along Highway 125 when they were retiring. That was over 35 years ago. My father has since passed away, but my mother was 92 and was still living there at the time of the occurrence I'm going to tell you. My sister was widowed right then, in her 50s, and has never remarried. She lived with my mother after my dad died, so neither one was alone. It was a good arrangement for them both. The land has about 2 acres cleared at the front in a square shape around the house. From there are some level woods, and then it rolls up to hills that are also wooded. There are 2 bodies of water on that property. A small pond with a plastic liner that was put in for goldfish and water lilies up near the house. Dad did that while he was still alive because he liked to look at them. There was also a natural clay-bottomed pond farther back on the property, out by the original homestead for that piece of land. Now that old house was actively being reclaimed by the forest and is completely surrounded by the woods that I mentioned that led up to the hills. At some point in time, the original people who lived in that homestead house had planted a lot of different things out there, and I gather that a lot of that wooded area must have been clear back in time. You will find runners of strawberries in the strangest of places out there, and I don't think they're wild. They don't look or taste like wild strawberries. There's also huge thickets of blackberries, and mint has taken over everything like a ground cover. The house itself is now being torn apart by vines, tree limbs, and rot from holes in the old wood roof. Yes, that house is so old it had wood shakes for a roof, not roof shingles. It's all rotting slowly and sinking into the forest. It's a strange sight to see, but we got used to it. Mom has always been a canner, and she used to go out to get the berries herself. But time takes its toll on a person in some very unkind ways. We had begun to suspect that Mom was getting a form of dementia or Alzheimer's, but tests weren't conclusive yet. She had lived on that land for 30 years at that point, but there were a couple times that spring that she had walked out near the old homestead, and she couldn't find her way back. Sis had to go out and find her. There were things like that were beginning to happen more and more, but Mom was still mostly present more than she was not, and at that time when she was present, she wanted to can blackberry jam. So my sister geared up and went out to get the blackberries. When my sister called me out of the blue later that day, she was rambling on and on about some person-animal thing. She was calling to ask me what she should do. And before I heard fully what happened that day, I was thinking, well, that's a dumb thing. If it's a person, you call the sheriff. If it's an animal out of control like a bear, you call Ohio Game. So why are you calling me? But my sister was adamant. It was not a person trespassing, and it wasn't an animal like a bear she should be concerned about. It was, as she kept calling it, a person-animal. I told her to slow down, start from the beginning, and tell me what happened. She said she was out there, and she'd been out there for over an hour, hour and a half picking the berries. She was working her way down a long wall of blackberry thicket facing near the old homestead. Those thickets, they probably go 100 feet deep back. Oh, I'm probably exaggerating. I really don't know how far they go. I've never measured them. I never cared to. I've never gone into them, and I don't care how big it is. Besides, it's impossible to actually go into them as they are so thick. Well, That's what I thought. But the wall of berries on the outer facing of the thicket was always more than enough for what my mom needed for her canning. The run of thicket there is 30 feet wide in that area. These blackberry bushes have been left to grow wild for 70 or 80 years, maybe longer according to the previous owner. So they are very impassable, and they have taken over everything. The thicket runs 6 to 7 feet high, with branches trailing everywhere. Sis had been picking out there for a while, and the bucket was a little more than half full. Then she said she began to feel uneasy. The sun had suddenly gone in, and now it was all gray shadows out there. Her feeling of unease grew. She kept hearing something moving, but she didn't know where it was. Sometimes it sounded like it was in the far back of the thicket. Sometimes it sounded like it was somewhere else. Now, hearing things move out there wasn't all that unusual. Many times we had all ran into different animals out there. Usually they were out there eating the berries, mostly deer. But those animals were usually on the outside of the thicket, just like she was, because of all the thorns. She had never heard anything big moving inside the blackberry thicket. She also knew that bears came to those berries, and bears might be able to ignore the thorns and work their way through. She didn't know, so she was being very cautious. Whatever it was moving slowly. It would move, then stop. Move, then stop. She waited to hear something that would tell her what it was. A bear chuff, a deer snort, something. She said it would move forward slowly, like it was being careful, and it would stop over and over. She couldn't figure out what it was. She didn't know, but she decided it was time to back away from the thicket. Maybe she could see something along the wall moving that she couldn't see standing up close to it. And she just wanted to give herself more room from whatever animal it might be. On the one hand, she was getting spooked, and she wanted to call it a day. But on the other, she knew she didn't have near enough berries to fire up the canner. She had a small bowl she was holding in her hand to collect the berries, and then she had a large bucket on the ground that she would dump the bowl into when it got full. She dumped her bowl into the bucket and was grabbing the bucket handle to start backing away from the thicket and head home when a very unpleasant smell came to her nose. It was not a sewer smell, she said, nor was it an animal smell or like a wet dog smell. It was something closer to burning sulfur, like when you lit a match, but amplified. She looked up, and then over to her left where she thought she heard something move in the thicket. Then she quickly turned back to her right because she saw movement above the thicket. On the other side of the blackberry thicket, there stood a red-haired, what she called, person animal. The head and its shoulders were visible to her. Her first thought, incredibly, wasn't, "What is it?" but rather, "How did it get there from the other side?" The old blackberry thickets are incredibly interwoven and dense, and they have an incredible amount of thorns on every branch. You will get ripped up just trying to walk a foot into them. She said it stood there looking at her. The eyes were light brown. The eye sockets, she said, were set level with the cheekbones, giving the face a flat look rather than being set deep in the head. The nose was formed just like a human's, but much wider. The lips were full and wide, and it had a sloping forehead, and its head was set down deep onto its shoulders like a gorilla. She could see nothing lower than the shoulders. So we guesstimate that this animal was about 7.5 to 8 feet tall. In fact, she first thought that it was a gorilla that she was looking at, but immediately she knew it was not. She stood there rooted to the spot, afraid to move, and afraid not to. She kept looking at it when she heard what she described as the way Ewoks in Star Wars sounded, but deeper and throatier. And it was coming from the left, where she thought she had heard something before she saw this on the right. She heard this as she's looking at the one making eye contact with her, so she knows that was not the one that spoke. That meant there was a second one. Now the one she was looking at answered the other one, though, and that too was Ewok talk, as she called it. She said it didn't open its mouth very much when it talked. She couldn't say much about the teeth because she really couldn't see them. She said she was scared out of her wits. She was standing there with just a blackberry bush between her and the most frightening creature she has ever encountered. She backed up a bit to make sure it wasn't going to follow. Then, in a panic, she turned and ran back to the house. She ran and left the bucket half full of berries behind her. She got in the house, did not want to alarm Mom, went to the basement, and called me immediately. My sister is a solid woman. She is not given to hysterics or storytelling, I can assure you. So I drove over there immediately. Together, we walked back out to that thicket. There was still a bad smell hanging in the air out there, but whatever she had seen was gone, and so was the bucket. After a little searching, we found the bucket 40 or 50 feet away on a diagonal from where it had been left. The bucket was on its side. It looked like it had been thrown or tossed. There were no berries where the bucket was. There were no line of berries spilled from where it might have been picked up and thrown either. The berries were mostly gone. I went back and I got some extra clothing from Dad's closet. I was going to try to protect myself against the thorns. My big idea was I was going to go check out inside that thicket. There was an old ATV out in the garage, so I rode that out there. When I got out there, I stood up on the seat of the ATV to try to look up and over the thicket. I was trying to see what I could see, if anything. If they were tall enough for her to see over the thicket, if they were out there in that thicket, I should be able to see them, right? It looked like, though, what I could see was a maze inside that thicket. You could see clear lines where something had been moving all that thicket aside to make a trail. I walked all the way around, and I found a few large holes on the back side of the thicket walls, which we didn't ever walk around to because, well, we never needed to. All the berries we needed were right on the front of the wall. What scared me is it looked like big game trails through there, and we knew nothing of them. I thought about walking in to see what I could see, and there was no way I was going in there. Nope, I backed out. I decided whatever was tough enough to build a trail through those old thorny blackberry thickets, it was tougher than me, and I wasn't going in there to stir it up if it was in there. For people who track those sorts of things, it might be of interest to note that this thicket is right where a lot of strawberry runners were, and it was less than 20 feet away from that larger pond. Now, Mom had said she thought that a few years before, all the strawberries had died out because every time she went out to pick them, there were none to be had. Now I suspect that something out there got to them before Mom did. That had happened with the blackberries, too, on the front wall of the thicket where we had picked them, because from day one that Mom moved in, she was out there trimming those bushes the right way along there to make them produce a lot of fruit, whereas the older, unpruned vines in the middle of the thickets apparently weren't putting out much fruit. Now, I'm no farmer, and I don't know how that works, but I do remember Mom talking about having to prune that front wall to get a better crop. I did not find any footprints that I could find anywhere near there. But again, the whole area is nothing but a thick mat of mint where you walk. You can see that things have been walking through there, but you cannot see their prints. I didn't know what to make of what Sis said she saw, but my sister had never been a storyteller, I know that. When we got back to the house, she point blank said to me out of the blue, she thought she saw a Bigfoot. Now, coming from my stick-in-the-mud sister, and that is not an offensive way to talk about her, honestly, if you know her, but my stick-in-the-mud sister, who doesn't know how to lie to someone even to tease or prank them, well, I stopped, and I had to think twice about what she was saying. Until right that moment, I never seriously considered that there could be a Bigfoot-type animal in Ohio. I thought maybe they were elsewhere in the world. I mean, we heard about the Yeti and all these things out west. But Ohio? I remembered growing up hearing something about a Minerva monster. But we all thought at the time that it was just a big hoax and that those people were looking for attention. Well, I've looked back into all of that, and now I don't think it was a hoax, and those people have never wanted any attention. Now, Minerva was nowhere near close to Adams County, but Ohio is Ohio. I reckon it could travel. Other things had also been happening, and they continued to happen, so much so that I began to believe my sister was right. I personally had heard some strange screeching sounds out there at night coming from the direction of the old homestead. Now, over the years, I had heard things like that and other things, but I just passed them off as stuff that's out there. I didn't know what they were. But those screeches match nothing that I can find to this day. One weekend, I had a friend who was helping me tear out and rebuild the back deck there, as it was very old and unstable at the back of the house. My friend stayed late that day, and we grilled out for all of us. It was about 10:30 p.m., and he was just saying that it was time to get going on home, and we were talking about what time to start in the morning, when that screeching started. Everything out there fell quiet. My friend grew up in Idaho, and he spent his entire career in a variety of law enforcement positions. He retired a few years prior from the Kentucky State Police. He also was a hunter his entire life. He looks over at me with a quizzical look and says, "What the bleep was that?" I said, "I don't know. You're the hunter. You tell me." He looked at me, shook his head, and he said he had never heard anything like that. What kind of weird things we got up here in Ohio? And he laughed. But he stayed a little while longer to listen, and he still couldn't figure out what it was. We talked a bit the next day while we were working, and over lunch I finally told him what my sister said she saw out there. At first he laughed. He thought I was pulling his leg. But my straight face was still straight when he was done laughing. That, I think, is when he started to take me seriously. This is happening later in early September, about 6 weeks after my sister saw what she saw out there in the thicket. He said he wanted to go see this area. So we walked back there. But we didn't go unarmed. I don't know what kind of a handgun he had, but he went to his truck and got something out. All I know is he said that he wasn't afraid of anything with that gun. Now, to my surprise, the big entrance to the thicket around the backside that I had found previously was now blocked off, very deliberately. It looked like whole parts of a blackberry bush or several bushes had been pulled up and were woven together to block that exit. Now, those bushes that blocked the exit were dead and or dying. Unlike all the fresh and green bushes all around, they really stuck out. He looked at that and he asked me, "Did you do this?" I said, "No." While he's out there walking around, I'm not feeling good about being out there. I didn't have this feeling when Sis called me out there before, but I had it right then. He found another entrance over on the west side. He started to go in. It was clearly a well-used entrance, and I don't believe it was there before. All the blackberry limbs I could see had been broken and pushed backwards or straight down to make the trail. And the trail, by my reckoning, was at least 3 feet wide. I said to him, "Don't go in there." He half laughed at me, and that's when he said he wasn't afraid of anything with that gun. He said what kind of gun it was, but I don't remember. I'm not a gun person, and I was more focused on getting him to not go in there. I had a really bad feeling about it. But he went on in the thicket anyway. Me? I was not going in. I stood at the entrance with my stomach doing flip-flops. I felt like I was a lookout for some criminal activity, and something really bad was about to go down. After a couple of minutes, he comes back out, and when he walks out of the thicket, I notice that he smells like that smell, like really strong, like it stuck all over him just by being in there. And he told me that something was very much living and or sleeping in there. There was a big nest-like area, probably about 9 feet long and about 6 feet wide. He said it was more oval-shaped. There were lots of small rodent bones, piles of acorn caps, and all sorts of things. Dead debris, like maybe he'd pulled up plants and was eating it. He confidently said that it must be a black bear, and to just leave it alone, let's go. But there was something about the way he said it that I don't think he believed it either, because I know I'm not a hunter, and I didn't believe a word he just said. I asked him about the Ewok sounds that she had heard. Do bears make that sound? He said no. He said my sister was probably just hearing a porcupine that was somewhere in the thicket or nearby. He said porcupines make the cutest, strangest little chattering noises, and then he proceeded to tell me all about a funny story of a call he had one night when he was still at the Kentucky State Police. It was a woman who thought there was a demon talking to her under her porch. Turned out it was a porcupine that was happily enjoying something it was eating under there. I really wasn't amused by the story. Since then, I did look up porcupine sounds, and they do make some really cute little weird noises. If you've never heard them, look them up. They're cute as the dickens. I played them for my sister without telling her what it was, and I asked her from across the room, "Is that what you heard out there?" She laughed. She said, "No." She said, "That's really cute. What is it?" So I told her what she was hearing was a porcupine. Matter of fact, its name is Teddy, and it happened to be eating a big old pumpkin. Look him up on YouTube. He's cute. Now, what she said she heard was angry, and it was deep Ewok sounds, including grumbling and growls. Sis did not ever go back out there to pick berries ever again. The last time that I went out there was the day that I went out with my friend that I just told you about. I did not know that that would be the last time, though. By then, Mom began showing more and more signs of Alzheimer's, and over the winter it increased. And sure enough, her testing showed conclusively she was suffering from Alzheimer's. By January and February, Mom had taken a drastic turn and was becoming violent in the middle of the night for no reason. If anyone out there has ever dealt with people with Alzheimer's, you will understand, as much as it broke our hearts. We could not leave my sister there alone to handle my mother. It was more than she could do. It would be more than me and my sister together could handle. She needed care around the clock. Now, for all I know, there's still a couple of Bigfoots out there in those hills and forests of that property along 125. I do hope that whoever has the place now leaves them alone. Now, I'm no big fan of those animal people things that my sister saw, or Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, whatever. But there were probably a lot of times, I'm pretty sure, they could have hurt Mom or Sis before we ever knew they were there. Now, they could have, but they didn't. So I think turnabout is fair play. I'm all for just leaving them alone. Thank you, Cliff Hughes. Hi, my name is Jack Featherstone. I'm from northern British Columbia and First Nation. My story is from the 70s on Highway 16 on the Susquehanna. there was a lady who had her relationship ended and was devastated about losing her boyfriend and spent her time crying. She didn't eat, but cry. She would walk the highway at night crying, and this led to her disappearance. People seen her only walking and crying, and that was the last time seeing her. The natives believe that Bigfoot had pity on her and took her away. First Nations believe they have the power to mind-convince humans to follow them and take them. To this day, some people blame the Highway of Tears on Highway 16. Thank you for your time, and good night. Hello, Nance. My name is Joe. I hope all is well with you. To say I love your channel, that would be a great understatement. Just here recently on an 8-hour trip, we listened to about 15 to 20 hours of your YouTube videos. Me and my kids, we love listening. You do a great job narrating. Keeping 4 teenagers and a 20-year-old son interested was impressive. Well, here are my encounters. It was about October 2013. I was working third shift. I live in southern Indiana out in the country. Closest neighbor is about a half-mile down the road on either side. Woods are between us and the neighbors on one side, and a big wooded hill and about 80 feet high on the other side. There are hundreds of wooded acres behind us, and this is where I saw it. I was walking out to my car going to work. It was about 10 p.m. I think it was cloudy that night because I don't remember seeing the stars or moon. It was pitch dark. We don't have one of those security lights because I love the night sky. And those security lights, they just mess up the view. I just use a little flashlight to see where I'm going. So I got about 6 to 8 feet lit up in front of me. I got about halfway to my car, and I noticed these 2 bright red lights way up in this tree on the edge of the woods in my backyard. I thought, cool lights. Then I saw them blink. They were huge, round, red eyes up in that tree. I stopped and I thought, what is that? I didn't hear anything. I mean nothing. It was so quiet. Then I remembered seeing a big owl that was flying around snatching squirrels. I seen it fly through the woods and snatch a squirrel off a branch that summer. So I thought, that must be that owl up there. So I was just watching it for a few minutes, and it just kept looking at me. Then I saw it turn its head a few times, like it was looking at something behind it, but always turning back to look at me. Then the eyes just disappeared, and I thought, wow, how lucky was I to see that? Then a few seconds after the eyes disappeared, I heard what sounded like a branch snap, then a huge crashing sound, and a big thud that I felt more than I heard. Then what sounded like a freight train crashing through the woods moving fast. I stood still in shock, wondering, what just happened? Then I snapped out of it and I thought, I need to get in the car, now. By the time I got in the car, I didn't see or hear anything. Whatever it was has ran deeper into the woods. I said to myself, that was no owl. I never heard anything make that much noise. When it was running, it sounded like the trees were snapping. The next morning I got home, and I saw smaller trees broken in the area that I heard whatever it was. I wasn't going to go any deeper. I figured, it left me alone, and I will leave it alone. I told people about this, and they think I'm crazy or something. It's nice to be able to tell someone without being judged. Whatever it was a lot bigger than anything I know of around here. Not long after that, I moved to day shift at my work. One morning driving to work, I drove past this creek that I have driven past thousands of times. The creek always floods after a heavy rain, but most of the time it has a small stream in it. The creek is about 10 to 15 feet wide and has banks about 4 to 5 feet high. It was pretty much dry at this time, and I have never seen anything in that creek besides the creek rocks. But on this morning, I saw something black in that creek. The closer I got, I saw how huge it was. It looked like how a gorilla that I had seen at a zoo sits, but this thing was huge. It took up about half the creek bed, and it was taller than the creek banks, and it looked like it was sitting. As I drive by it, there were trees in the way, so I lost sight of it. I stopped, and I turned around to go back to see what it was, and it was gone. Only the creek rocks there. Nothing around. I knew we had black bears coming into our area, but they don't get near that big. I had a good look at it as I was driving up to it, but it looked like I was looking at the back of a gorilla, solid black and hairy. A couple of months later, on the interstate exit I take to go home coming from work, I saw something chase a deer across both the east and westbound lanes of I-64. This exit is about 5 miles from where I saw that thing sitting in the creek. I was about a quarter mile from the exit. I had clear vision of both east and westbound lanes as well as the bridge going across the interstate. That is when I saw the deer booking it across the interstate. It ran over the bank at my exit, and I could tell exactly where it crossed because of the white lines on the road and the off-ramp. I could tell it ran right past the speed limit sign for the off-ramp. Just about the time the deer reached that sign, I saw something black come up from the other side of the interstate chasing that deer. I could tell it was running faster than the deer, and I thought to myself, it's going to catch it. I watched as that black thing crossed the interstate road and ran across my exit. I saw where it crossed my exit the same way I saw the deer. That thing ran over the third cross line that the state put between the road and the off-ramp. That third line was right across from the speed limit sign the deer passed by, and that black thing passed by the sign. All this happened in seconds, but I got a good clear view of this chase. They were both in the woods by the time I got to my exit. I stopped at that speed limit sign to check if I could see anything. I couldn't see either of them. I looked at that speed limit sign and I thought to myself, no way. I got out, and I stood next to that sign, and it was at least 8 feet tall. That black thing was as tall as that sign. I hurried, and I got back in my car. I took off, and I thanked the Lord that I was heading south, and that thing was running north. I don't know what it was. Nothing around here gets that big. The only thing I thought of was a Bigfoot or a dog man. Then I remember years before these sightings, I had had my kids on the Ohio River bank on the Indiana side fishing one clear night. The moon was shining on the river, and it was beautiful. It was quiet, and we were having a great time fishing. I heard what I thought sounded kind of like elks call out, but it was different. I know some elks were released in Kentucky, but I didn't think they were that far north. But I thought, cool. Then we heard another one. Sounded like they were calling back and forth to each other on the Kentucky side. We thought it was cool. Then we heard one sound off behind us deep in the woods on the Indiana side. I thought, that is weird, and it was time to go. I never thought anything about it. Then, the next weekend, we went to this small lake about 20 miles north of the Ohio River in Indiana to fish. It's in the Hoosier National Forest. We got all set up to fish, and I heard the same sound come from across the lake. I knew we didn't have elk in our area. I couldn't see anything. Across the lake, there was a big clearing from the bank to the trees that was about 50 yards wide. Whatever it was making that sound was in the woods. I got my kids out of there. We have been back since, but never heard or seen anything since. There are stories across the river in Kentucky about something they call sheep squatch, some Bigfoot-like creature with horns. I looked it up, and I found what some said it sounds like. It sounded just like what we heard at the river that night and at the lake. Made me wonder. All of this is true, but I have no idea what that thing could have been. Makes me wonder what could be out there. Keep up the good work. Love listening to the stories, and it's comforting to know I'm not the only one that had an experience like this. It also kind of helped just typing it out. Thanks, Joe. To Nance and the Buckeye Bigfoot channel. My name is Rosanna. I never saw the creature, but I was in the periphery when this happened, and I did hear all the screams. I believe 100% what the person here told me that happened, because it all lined up with everyone else's story surrounding it, including mine, and you'll understand when I'm finished. This was in northern Minnesota. It happened at a private lake area where you can rent cabins up along the lake. It was July 2008. I had gone up with my new boyfriend and his friends. I had only been dating this guy for about 6 weeks, and these were his friends from childhood. It was my first time meeting them because they didn't all live in the same city anymore. There were 6 of us total, 3 couples. Me and my boyfriend Maurice, his friend Court and his girlfriend Rochelle, and then there was Mike and Rhonda. First day there, the people in the cabin next to us walked over to tell us there had been howling and screams the night before. They said they found prints out on the other side of the lake that wound around their cabin. They said something was prowling their cabin in the middle of the night, and their children would no longer sleep alone in their room, but insisted on sleeping with them in their room at night. We didn't know these people. We thought they were just trying to scare us, because it all seemed odd the way they just came over out of the thin air to tell us all these things like we knew them. There they were, a family with young children, and here we were, a group of 6 young people who looked like we were probably going to be up all night drinking, which was actually the plan. We thought they just said all that to get us to maybe leave or move a cabin because they thought we were going to bother them. And we probably would have had they stayed. But turns out they said they were leaving early, and they did leave within an hour or so after telling us all this. There were other cabins out along the lake with people in them, but our cabin was at the end of that line of cabins. And between the cabin that those people next to us had just left and to the next cabin that had people in it was probably a football field's length. The distance between the sets of cabins was because of the topography around that side of the lake. There were some huge rock formations around the bend of the lake. You couldn't have put cabins there. That left a huge gap between the cabins, but you could still look down and see the whole shore. The first night there started quiet. We ate, and then we stayed up at a fire outside near the shore, drinking. We finally went to bed a little bit after midnight. We had actually started drinking beer early, and turned out none of us could stay up as late as we thought, because of all the beer. I woke up that night to the sound of one of the other girls screaming. It was Rochelle. Now, I thought maybe her and Court were arguing again because they had been giving little snide remarks and digs at each other all evening. All day, really. We all knew something wasn't good between them that day, and we tried hard to ignore it. It was uncomfortable all day because of them. But then I heard what was being said out there, and the hall light was turned on. I could see the outline of light around our closed door. Then one of the guys was banging on our door. I didn't know what was happening. My boyfriend got up and opened the door. There was a lot being said in the hallway. A lot was going on out there. Turned out, Rochelle said that she woke up and she realized that someone or something was looking in the window. She had left it open to get some night air. These cabins were very minimal in style. There was very little fabric in the whole cabin other than sheets and towels. There weren't even any scatter rugs. No curtains on the windows, just blinds. Rochelle had left the blinds up so she could look at the night sky while she fell asleep to the breeze coming in the window. These cabins do not sit flush on the ground. They're raised up off the ground, I assume, in case the lake waters rise. I'm 5 feet 7 inches tall. When I stood outside the next day by their window, I stretched up on my tippy toes, and I could barely touch the bottom of the windowsill with my fingertips. Now, whatever stood out there must have been 9 feet tall or higher. That side of the cabin had scrub grass growing right up to it, and you could see something had smashed down the grass in that area. Now, those cabins weren't far from the main bank of woods that wrapped all around that lake. Most was cleared all the way up by the cabins, but there were a few groups of pine and fir trees left here and there, I guess to make it look a little better and not so bare around the cabins. Our opinion was someone was on stilts out there, some prankster going around and scaring people. Now that sounds really stupid and funny, I know, but someone 8 feet tall looking in a remote cabin window, that's pretty stupid and funny sounding on its own. We had come to the conclusion that it had to be someone from the other end of the lake with just a little too much time on their hands while the circus was on summer break or something. Okay, we were kidding about the whole circus thing, sort of. We really did think it had to be somebody who knew how to use stilts, who had the chance to pull the prank of a lifetime off. I mean, wouldn't that be funny? We eventually went back to sleep that night, but within that hour, we were all still awake, and we all heard the screams out in the trees behind the cabin. "We should call the police," someone said. But we didn't, because the guys assured us that it was just some animal out there screaming. I tried to believe them, and I tried to go back to sleep, but that screaming went on and off all the way to daylight. There was no sleep for me. The next day, we asked the people at the other end of the lake in their cabins, had they heard the screams? None of them had. But we were all the way at the other end of the lake on the bend, so we reasoned that maybe it was possible they just couldn't hear it all the way down there. Day 2 went like day 1. We stayed up even later drinking, though. The guys thought they were going to catch themselves that prankster. I couldn't stay awake anymore, so I went into the cabin to go to sleep. Not long after, I heard the other 2 girls come in as well. I don't know what time it was that the guys came in, but it was pretty late. They said they heard and saw nothing while they were out there. But within 15 minutes of them coming in, the screaming started. They turn on all the lights outside of the cabin, and they go out. We girls asked them not to do that, but they were all acting brave, and they started walking around the cabin with a flashlight and calling out to whoever it was. While they were out there, the one guy named Court, he got hit hard with a rock. I mean hard. It hit the side of his arm a few inches below the shoulder joint. This was not some little tiny pebble tap. It was a big rock, and he ended up with a huge bruise that showed the exact outline of where the rock hit him. It turned incredible shades of navy blue, purple, yellow, and green. He got hit really hard. He said he couldn't see where it came from, but the other 2 guys were standing within just a few feet of him, and he knew it wasn't them. And we 3 girls were in the front room of the cabin together, so he knew it wasn't us. That left the prankster. They came back in, and we heard screams on and off till daylight again. Day 3. The 6 of us were all exhausted. None of us had had much sleep, and we hadn't had a lot of fun, other than a few nights of sitting out and drinking by the fire. But even that came with its own chilled worry. Like the other people who talked to us when we had first gotten there, we were talking of leaving early. And by now, yes, by now, that famous word, Sasquatch, it was being tossed around. One of the other girls started using it first and said that was what was out there and that we should probably leave. The 3 guys just poo-pooed her, saying it was all BS and there was nothing happening out there other than a prankster. But the more she talked about it and the more she laid out what she knew about Sasquatch, the more it seemed like it could be a possibility. I mean, is Sasquatch any more improbable than some circus person on stilts out there running around a lake at night? I mean, no matter which way you went, Sasquatch, crazy weirdo on stilts, well, it sounded like a bunch of Hollywood movie BS. We said, let's stay one more night and see what happens. It was quiet most of that night. We thought maybe we got lucky and whoever it was, they had checked out and gone home. The guys had gone fishing that day, and they had managed to catch some fish. They had trimmed them out, and we roasted them outside for dinner. Well, all the stuff that they cut and trimmed off the fish, they tossed out by one of the great big fir trees not far from the cabin. I say they, but it was actually Court that did it. I saw him do it, and when he did it, I said, "That's not a good idea. That could attract a bear or something." He didn't like that, and he laughed at me and said I was being stupid. But Mike said the same thing and backed me up. But Court got mad, went over, grabbed a grocery bag, put it over one hand like a glove, and began picking up pieces of the fish that he could and put them in another grocery bag. Then he tied that bag up and dropped it in the trash can out there on the porch. I started to open my mouth again, but I could see he was already in a bad mood, so I wisely kept my mouth shut and went over and told my boyfriend Maurice, who then went and got it from the can out there. And by the way, that trash can wasn't supposed to be out on the cabin porch. The guys had brought it outside from the kitchen. So Maurice pulled the bag out of the trash can, walked over to the tree line way behind the cabin, opened the bag, and dumped it. When he got back, he said, "Well, that must be where everyone dumps all their stuff because, oh my, it smelled awful out there." Now it's starting to get dark, and the guys are talking about sitting up out on the little cabin porch all night to catch this prankster. We said we would sit with them. Only problem was, everyone kept talking, and talking would keep whoever away because then they'd know we were out there. So we all agreed that we were going to sit in the dark and not talk. Well, you know what was going to happen. You're in the dark, in silence. Sooner or later, you will start falling asleep. I was going in and out of sleep. I would start to go to sleep, and then I would shake awake, remembering where I was and that I was outside unprotected. One time, I did get to deep sleep, and I don't think I was the only one. We're out there, in the dark, all sleeping in our sling chairs on the porch. Now, whoever it was, they must really not have liked Court, because suddenly in the darkness, Court yelled out, "Ow!" And immediately we heard something hit the wood floor of the cabin deck. Court had been hit by another rock. We all start scrambling out of our chairs. At the same time, we could hear something running away. The pounding footsteps on the ground were clear. And it must have been very near the cabin when it started running, because the sound was close, and when you could hear it move from near the cabin, brushing through the trees out back, all the way to the wooded tree line. The guys had decided enough was enough. They were going to chase down whoever this was. We asked them not to, but all three boys were off that porch like rockets in the night. We girls went inside and did the only thing we could do, which was wait. Then we heard one of those awful screams like we had heard the last several nights, only it sounded like it was right outside the front door. I jumped straight out of my chair. We all did. A few minutes later, we started to hear the guys yelling. They weren't screaming like they were being killed, but what we heard wasn't their normal voices. We three girls were just looking at each other like, what do we do? What are we supposed to do? Well, the only thing we could do was sit tight and wait. When the guys finally came in sometime later, they were clearly very shook up. I asked Maurice, what happened out there? And he kept shaking his head, saying, you wouldn't believe me. You're not going to believe me. I kept saying, try me. And this same conversation was going on with the other two couples. They were saying the same things to each other. The guys were shook up, and they didn't want to say what they had seen out there or what had happened. And to me, that was scarier than what they finally did say. And this is what they finally said happened. They were out there, and none of them were armed, by the way. The only thing they had was a flashlight. They were thinking, really, in their head, they were about to get into a knockdown, drag-out fist fight with some guy. Never did they anticipate they were about to run into Mr. Squatch himself. Or it might have been herself. I don't know. They didn't know either. The guys always said him or he, and sometimes it, when they talked about what they saw. They had gone out to the tree line way out back, which was the sound of where whoever it was had ran to after Court was hit with the rock on the porch. And he was starting to take that very personally, by the way, because this was his second time to get hit by a rock. And when he was hit, Court was neither in the middle of the group on the porch, nor was he on the edge. Thinking on it later the next day, when Court said he thought that he was being specifically targeted, we all began to wonder if maybe he wasn't right. We don't know why, though. There was someone angled sitting in front of him in a chair on the porch, so whoever hit him had to aim right between two other people to hit him square in the chest like they did. Now, it might have been pure luck in the darkness with that throw. Maybe. But none of us have a theory as to why it continually targeted him. But back to them being out in the dark in the trees. They're shining the flashlight all around, just knowing they're going to catch some weirdo out there. They were planning to beat the ever-living crap out of him. Those were their words. They were frustrated. They were exhausted from lack of sleep, and they were angry that they were not getting exactly the kind of love from us ladies that they had planned on getting that week. Why? Because we were all tired, cranky, and too spooked for any kind of lovin' because of whoever this prankster was. So yes, they were going to beat the ever-living snot out of him, to use another form of their words. On the way out to the tree line, Mike had bent down and picked up a rather large fallen branch. He said later that it was instinctual. They were heading out there into the darkness, possibly to do battle. He saw it, and he picked it up. That turned out to not maybe be a good idea. Court had the flashlight, and he's in the lead. The other two guys are clustered around him. Mike has the tree limb, and he's holding it like a bat. Mike said it then felt like another baseball bat hitting him right across his back from behind. He gets hit hard. He goes down, and he's eating dirt. He later says that he didn't know what was happening. All he knew was he heard the other guys running away. They didn't even scream or yell. They did not stop to help him or pick him up. He said he had had the wind knocked out of him. He had been hit so hard. His eyes are open in the darkness while he's laying there, trying to get his breath, and then he starts to freak out because he realizes the guys ran away with the flashlight, and he's alone there in the dark. Except he's not alone, and he knows it. He said something is standing very close to where he's laying. He can hear it breathing. He can smell the musty animal odor. When all this is over, and he got to come out of those woods, Mike didn't even try to hide that he peed on himself right then. But right then, he said he didn't move when he realized he was not alone, not a muscle. He said he played pure possum. What he next felt was he thought a bear nosing him to move him to see if he was still alive. And that's why he played dead. He had always heard, play dead if a bear attacks. Something nudged him on his side, just below his rib cage. Then it nudged again, even harder. But it didn't feel like a bare snout or a bare paw. He couldn't figure it out. But he kept telling himself to stay stiff, don't move a muscle. He said he was even holding his breath. He was terrified. He was alone in the dark, with something big nudging him to see if he was dead. Then he heard his name being called from the edge of the tree line. The other two guys were out there yelling for him. Before they had made it all the way to the cabin in their panic, they realized that Mike was still out there and that they couldn't just leave him. So they gathered up their courage and they had gone back. When they were standing on the edge of the tree line calling for Mike, that's when we heard them from while we were inside the cabin. They're shining the flashlight, but it doesn't go as far as where he is deep in the tree line. But he says that while laying there, he could see the light over that way, and he could see that they were coming closer. So, too, did whatever it was standing there by him. He saw the outline of the legs when the light shined behind it. He said he could only see from its knee area down, but he saw the fuzzy fur in the light. Lots of things were going through his head right then, and he said he was wondering where the rest of the bear was. Why was it up on two legs? Then the word Sasquatch came down into his brain, and he was the one that had poo-pooed it the hardest the day before, by the way. That, he said, is when he pissed himself. Now, the other two guys are coming back into the tree line to look for him. They finally got their guts up to go help him if they could, facing whatever they had to. And I guess them coming back is what made the Sasquatch leave. We don't know. We've tried to understand, but nobody has a guess as to why it walked off after hitting one of them. We speculated that the reason it hit Mike is because he saw it as a threat. Mike was the only one carrying something weapon-like, as in the big tree limb. Mike said that he expected his life was going to end right then when he first saw the big legs move. He thought it was raising its foot up to stomp on him. But instead, it walked over him. He heard and felt it walk away through the ground vibrations. Mike said he was holding his breath for so long that he had begun to see white spots out in the darkness, almost as if he was about to pass out. When he started breathing again, he tried to yell, or at least that's what he called it. To the guys coming into the trees, they said it sounded like a weak baby calf bawling, not at all like a grown man yelling for help. They got to him, they got him up, and they were going to help him back to the cabin because they thought he was hurt. Well, what do you know? Karma's a bitch, as they say. Because once on his feet, Mike did a turnabout as fair play, and he shot like a rocket through those trees all the way back to inside the cabin. The guy stood there, they said, for another half-second before they started following him. He got into that cabin, and he was so frightened he locked the cabin door, turned around, and looked at us three girls wild-eyed. Then we heard the banging on the door, which scared us terribly, until we realized it was the other two guys. He let them in. At that point, that is when we clearly saw that Mike had pissed himself. His pants clearly showed the dark outlines. Can't say I blame him. Of course, we all agree that it's time to go ahead and get the heck out of here. We're not going to stay any longer. We did try calling the cabin management company, but at that time of the middle of the night, we only got their voicemail. We told them we were going to vacate early, and they could call if they want for details. We were talking about calling the authorities, but it really felt like a bizarre thing that nobody was going to believe. Mostly, we just wanted to get out of there. We were already packing and got out of there right with the sunrise. Mike never changed his pants until we were leaving, and only then because Court told him he could not get in his car with urine-soaked pants, which were still wet-looking. Over the hours, while waiting to leave and packing for the ride home, we heard what happened from each of them in turn, and we were all comparing notes with one another. Sure, we had heard of the BFRO, and we were thinking of contacting them, but then we felt foolish, and then we got afraid. It wasn't our property, and when the management had contacted us back about leaving early, we told them what happened. That's when they started screaming at us and telling us that we better not be spreading any of those kinds of rumors, and we better not leave a review mentioning any of that, or they would come after us with lawyers. Did we understand about libel laws? So we didn't contact anyone. Now I know there was really nothing that they could have done to us. We could have posted all the reviews we wanted. We could have told the whole world. But that 22-year-old that I was at the time, I didn't know that. I had no money and I was scared. The whole mention of lawyers and lawsuits, that scared me. So no, we didn't call anyone. I didn't know what they could and could not do if I did tell anyone. We were all young, poor, and easily silenced. The one thing that Mike said over and over was it was one thing to be frightened, laying there, when he thought it was a bear nudging him. But it was quite another level of fear when he realized that it was really a Sasquatch checking to see if he was dead. He says the way it just stood there after it kept nudging him made him believe it was waiting to see if he was going to move or not. To Mike, that spoke of intelligence. It was reasoning. It was thinking. And he feels that if those other guys hadn't come back for him, that Sasquatch would have carried him off. Beyond that, he refuses to speculate about why or what would have happened. Now that was the one and only time that the 6 of us were ever all together. I never spoke to the other 4 really again after that. I think once they might have called my boyfriend's place when he was showering and he told me to answer the phone. But that's it, because me and that guy, we didn't make it another couple months. It had nothing to do with that weekend. It's just, no matter how hard you try, sometimes things don't work out. Thanks for letting me get this off my chest after all these years, and I'm not worried that anyone is going to come after me about libel, slander, or any of that now. Thanks, Rosanna. It was June 16th, 2004. We were on a road that went through the Susquehanna State Forest in Pennsylvania. We had spent the morning riding around, and there are several roads through there. I don't remember which one for sure, but I think it was Robinson. We were killing time to meet up with my sister and her husband and kids, who were meeting us midweek to spend the rest of the week together camping. They had the camping reservation, so we had to wait for them. We got there early and decided to drive all around the state forest. It was between 9:30 and 10 a.m. It was sunny and clear. The road there is cut on a slight slope, so to one side the land rises up slow and goes down on the other side. It's heavy forest on both sides of the road, and the road is shaded with heavy tree cover. I had some deer up later than usual out on the front part of the road where we turned in. They were up in the trees alongside, and I almost missed seeing them. Ever since, I had been looking very carefully on my side of the road as we drove up into the trees on the slope, looking for deer and other animals. The sun was coming in between the leaves of the trees, so there were light and dark spots, and my eyes were constantly readjusting. I was scanning up the slope. We were doing, I believe, about 35 or 40 miles an hour. I saw something. It was moving horizontally, walking parallel to the road, but it was some distance away from the road. The passing of light and then dark shadows as we drove made it hard for my eyes to see. I asked my husband to slow down. I wanted to see it. I didn't know what it was, but I wanted to take a look. I felt safe in the car, even if it was a big bear. I knew we could drive off faster than a bear could get down from the slope. My husband stops. He says, "What?" I look for it, and I find it. We had stopped in a shaded spot on the road with trees overhead, so I wasn't fighting glare or sunlight. I found it, and I pointed it out to my husband, who then saw it. Right then, I was wondering what it was. First thought, a hunter dressed up. But it was not camo, and I saw no rifle, bow, arrows, or any sort of weapon. It was pure black. First glance, it didn't look bigger than a human. Second glance, I saw it was wider than a human, and it walked with a very strange rhythm. We sat silently in the car, watching it. Together we had eyes on it for about 30 or 40 seconds. We both saw it. It started to move out of our range of sight, so my husband slowly eased off the brake and moved forward along the road until we could see it again. It must have heard us. It turned to look at us. Then it made an abrupt turn to its right and went farther away from the road up the slope. We sat there until we couldn't see it in the trees anymore. Our impression was that it wasn't concerned with us one bit. It did seem annoyed, and it just wanted to get away from us. There was no aggression, no sounds, no smells. We were not frightened. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 to 3 minutes until we finally couldn't see it anymore and drove on. We both agree in the description of the creature. It did not look unusually tall, heavy, or unusually muscular. Just wider. It was black and covered all over with what we think is fur in that color. That was as much as we could see from our point on the road. We also agree it was clearly on 2 feet. The arms we saw swung when it walked. We saw no ears, snout, or sloped shoulders. We have encountered many bears in our travels, and all the bears we've ever seen had a lighter snout than the body fur, even the grizzlies. This creature did not. The face was black and was very flat with no snout. Beyond that, we could observe no particulars of the face from the car. Thank you. Signed, Jen and Anthony Casanelli. Please only use my first name. I was raised about 40 miles and some change from Birmingham, Alabama. I've been an avid hunter and fisherman from as far back as I can remember. It was not uncommon back then for a 10-year-old to responsibly hunt by himself, and I'm 54 now. So, I rarely left the house without a .22 rifle or an old double-barreled 12-gauge thrown over my shoulder, starting with turkey, squirrel, and rabbit season and ending with deer season. So needless to say, I was in the woods more than I was home during that time of year. If we weren't in school, we were traipsing through the woods. We lived in north-central Alabama, with woods as far as you cared to walk. Never once during that time did I ever feel threatened or afraid, but at the very least, this caught me off guard. I had gotten up early on a bright, chilly fall morning and got my rig ready for an extended 3-day hunt. I think I was 15 at this time. I was going along a large meandering creek nearby, where deer tended to congregate in a nice wide piece of open bottom land, with just a thin strip of woods along the creek bank. My first day and night were fairly uneventful. I got to my spot, set up camp, and went on a scouting walk that evening to find where the deer were crossing. The second day, I had gotten to my hunting spot before daylight and set up to where I had an unobstructed view of maybe a 10-acre pasture and a good long straight area of the creek, including a nice shallow area that had a bunch of fresh tracks on both banks. I was situated in the corner of the pasture nearest the water. I hadn't been there an hour, and out of the woods on the far side of that 10-acre plot stepped 3 does, followed closely by what looked to be a 6 or 8-point buck. This field was overgrown with goldenrod, milkweed, and briars, so all I could see were the very tops of their backs, necks, and heads. They were walking slowly, sniffing the air, and stopping to look around every few steps. They had made it almost halfway when the buck, all of a sudden, let out a loud snort, wheeled around on his hind legs, and bounded off towards the woods at full speed, barely slowed down by the waist-high brambles. I thought, well, crap. Somehow they scented me and hauled Bud out of there. The does, however, scattered in 3 different directions, but all of them seemed to be making wide circles back to where they had entered the field. 2 of them had almost made it, when suddenly, a dark blur is the best way I can describe it, it came out from the narrow strip of trees on the creek bank. This thing was pretty big, because the waist-high on me weeds only came to this thing's mid-thigh. And when I say blur, I mean just that. It covered almost 100 yards in what seemed to be the blink of an eye, through thick briars and such, and it was on that doe before she could make 3 jumps over those weeds. I was maybe 160 yards or so from all of this, and I heard what I'm sure was this thing break that doe's neck. Then it stood up with a full-grown doe under his arm, like he was carrying the morning paper. All I could do was sit, dumbfounded, as I watched this thing walk back into the woods with his breakfast, trying to come to grips with what I had just seen. You may not believe a word of this, and to me, that's no matter. I know they are out there, and I am certain if they were of a mind to, they could sneak up and they could take us out with little to no problem. That's why I'm not too scared of them. Live and let live, though I'd hate to know that I was in the woods with one that I had somehow pissed off. Thanks for this outlet. This is the first time I have ever told this to a soul. P.S. I really love your channel, and thanks again for allowing me to share. It feels good to let it out. Signed, Barry. Hi. I love all the stories you narrate, and I fall asleep at night listening to as many as I can. I even try to re-listen to the ones that I fell asleep to when I get a chance. Awesome content. Anyway, my name is Rick, and I live in Michigan. But back in the summer of 1994, I was in California visiting my father. We were on forced visitation, as he and my mother divorced when I was 2. This would be the second time that I ever saw him. Anyway, while we were visiting, he took my sister and I with him, his wife, her daughter, and the daughter's friends to a campsite along the Yuba River Valley. I was never really into camping, but at 15 and under his supervision, I really had no choice. So, I tried to make the best of it by spending most of my time tubing down the river with his daughter's hot friends. And although I was kind of shy and was really sheltered by my mother most of my life, I still tried to be the cool one around the ladies. Anyway, one early morning I was interested in getting an early start, and I asked the 2 girls who were awake already if they'd be interested in joining me, tubing down the river. We hiked a little ways upstream and started from where the river was just getting deep enough to float down, and planned on floating all the way to the store at the end of the campground. It was a good 45-minute trip, with some slow parts, some fast parts, and even an area where there was still a gold panning trough constructed along the bank. The store was kind of the landing point where most of the people would get out of the river and grab a soda for their walk back to camp. The river got really shallow there, so you really couldn't tube much further anyway. They sold gold flakes and chunks of gold in little vials, smokes and sodas, and etc., as most of the river was constructed from gold rush trenching. It was just kind of the theme there. So myself and these 2 girls started floating in our separate tubes, and we were not talking much. I feel like it was because I always seemed to make a fool of myself trying to flirt with them. Or maybe they just really didn't want to talk. I don't know. I was kind of a dork anyway, so I don't blame them. They were a couple of the self-proclaimed pretty cool kids from my dad's block. Now, there weren't many areas of really deep water for most of that trip, but there were a few areas where it got exceptionally wider and deeper, including one area where some kids had put a rope swing to jump in from 10 feet plus above the river. It was considerably deep there. But on the other side of the river, across from the swing, was a semi-wooded area that came right up to the river's edge. It had a 20-foot drop-off cliff there and a small wooded area, right next to a small beach-like area. There were a few cabins along that side, but for the most part, it was wooded area. There we were, silently floating along. The sun was slowly rising, shining through the trees, and just making everything brighter. Just as we approached the widened swimming area, we heard a loud splash coming from near the cliff area. I personally didn't see the splash, but one of the girls did. She said it looked like something really big did a cannonball. By then, we all had our attention directed towards that area. We were waiting for whoever or whatever had jumped in to surface. I said, maybe it was a log or a big rock that fell in. I said that just as a big black head bobbed up from under the water. It didn't come up completely out of the water, but just high enough that we could see a flat brow and a set of black eyes looking right at us. It was clearly not a human. It was a good 60 feet from us, but close enough that all three of us started to pedal backwards to gain more distance from it. The girls were freaking out by then, and I was just frozen in shock. It bobbed under the water again, leaving what looked like leaves and a film of dirt on the surface of the water. On top of that, right then, we all caught a whiff of a smell that could only be described as a mixture of poop and that watery garbage juice that you find at the bottom of a dumpster. Now, we all thought that it was going under to swim over to us, so we started to panic a little. I started trying to look into the water, thinking any second it would swim up beneath my tube and drag me under. And it was underwater for quite a while, it seemed, almost as if it had vanished completely. But just as we thought, maybe we were crazy and just seeing things, it reemerged closer to the shore. This time, we all clearly saw its cone head, its wide shoulders and glistening fur. It quickly climbed out along the bank of the river, and it must have been 7 feet tall, if not taller. It turned its upper body around just enough to glance at us, and then it bolted into the tree line. We all looked at each other, completely bewildered. We went back and forth about seeing a Bigfoot, and what were we going to tell my father and the others when we got back to camp? Of course, by the time we got back from the long walk from the store stopping point, everyone was awake and starting breakfast. We tried telling everyone what we saw, but we could tell nobody believed us. We were just making it up, or we just saw a bear, etc. I'll never forget it. Even if they didn't believe us, we know what we saw. Anyway, thanks for reading this and sharing it if you choose to. Thanks, Rick. Hi, Nance. I've been sitting here listening to your channel, all the while contemplating sharing my story. Well, I finally made up my mind. So here is my encounter of my staring contest with Bigfoot. When I was 12 years old, back in 1998, I went on a trip with my best friend David and his parents to Wilhelmina, Oregon. The trip was going to take several days, and the goal was to visit David's grandmother and uncle. We lived in southern Utah at the time, and his parents opted to drive there and back. So we loaded up sandwiches, snacks, and drinks to save money and time on the road, and we headed out. After what seemed like forever on the road, we finally reached our destination late the following night. It was a small, green house with a basement garage half built into the ground for the lower level. Then the upper level was the main floor. It sat a few miles outside of Wilhelmina, back amongst a heavily wooded area with small, cleared fields on two sides of the house and a large yard. The road to it wasn't paved or smooth, and it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors or buildings or signs of civilization were immediately visible from his grandmother's home, but that didn't bother me or David at all. In fact, I loved it. I loved the fresh air, the cool air, the space to roam about freely. To me, it was perfect, with the sole exception of one tiny little problem. From the moment we got out of the truck, I felt like something was a little off, like something or someone was watching us from the trees. That first night in day one, I chalked it up to my nerves about a new and unfamiliar place, and that my mind was just playing games with me. So I did my best to shake it off and just enjoy myself. Day one, David and I played outside and had Nerf gun fights and played with the barn kittens. They were just big enough to play and think they were tough, but small enough to be fuzzy and adorable as heck. Then we went hiking that afternoon. All through our short hike, I felt eyes on us, but no matter how I looked around, I just couldn't see anything. It was like the trees themselves might have been the things watching us. I did notice that we didn't see anything. Nothing. No squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, deer, or any signs thereof. And the birds, they were quieter or just as dispersed as everything else. Still, I said nothing, despite my growing uneasiness, because I didn't know if it was just me or not. Once back at the house, David went in to watch TV, and I sat down on the couch to join him. But instead of watching TV, I found myself staring out the large front room windows, watching the tree line like a hawk. Though I saw no movement, I knew something was there. I just knew it. As the sun went down and it became too dark out there to see anything outside at all, really, I found myself wandering the house, looking for just one area where there were no windows. I was hoping to cut the line of sight with the thing that I felt watching us. In my wandering, I discovered a bunch of old toys in the basement garage, and I began distracting myself until David joined me. We were playing games and goofing off when we both just froze like someone had just yelled at us. We stopped at attention. But no one had yelled at us. In fact, there wasn't any reason that we should have suddenly stopped like we did. But simultaneously, we both froze and turned to the windows of the garage door that was not 12 feet from us. It was too dark to see anything outside the windows, but we both just slowly backed away from the door, neither saying a word, as we put the old toys away and hurried upstairs. It was obvious to me right then that I wasn't the only one feeling watched. David reacted the same time and the same way as I did the very moment that my hair stood on end when we got to that side of the basement and were too close to the only windows down there. That was creepy, I said nervously. I thought someone was looking in the window. David just chuckled nervously, and he didn't say a word, and he went on to get ready for bed. His grandmother had overheard us as we came upstairs while she sat at the kitchen table. I don't remember her exact words, but she began talking about the quote-unquote wild woman who lived out that way, saying she was harmless, and it was probably her at the window. That did not comfort me at all. I had heard stories of Bigfoot and of his supernatural/cryptid buddies. In fact, the whole topic had fascinated me since I was a little kid, and while I wanted to see one for myself, I really didn't like the feeling that I'd had since we arrived. And for some reason, I literally thought she was talking about a crazy homeless person out there roaming the woods around her house. And that scared me more than a possible Bigfoot or bear. I don't know why that thought scared me more than something that could actually eat me, but it did. Needless to say, that night I did not sleep well, especially since I was on the living room floor in full view of the two biggest windows in the house, and they had no curtains, just an uninterrupted view of the darkness outside. The next day was pretty uneventful. We mostly ran around town. We did some sightseeing and bought some souvenirs, visited some family friends, and a whole lot of nothing particularly interesting. Note, while we were shopping, I bought David and I some of those little cap guns that make the loud snapping noises with the rolls of snaps that you have to put in them. They were simple, loud, and fun, so I figured why not? Anyway, the moment that we got back to the house, that creepy being watched vibe hit us just like before, and we decided not to hang around outside any longer than need be, at least until David's cousin came by, and then we went and played outside and had a blast. I actually forgot all about that feeling for a little bit, but after he left and the sun started going down, I realized that that feeling was still there, just that I was actually getting used to it. Another sleepless and uneasy night passed, and the next morning after breakfast, David's grandmother asked us to go pick berries so she could make a pie as she handed us 2 ice cream buckets. That whole area was full of wild berries, thimbleberries, huckleberries, blackberries, even raspberries. I should probably mention a few things I forgot to mention earlier. David was a Boy Scout, badges and all, and he knew how to handle guns safely. So his uncle gave him a rifle to take with us this time. I was not a scout of any kind, but I did grow up camping, hiking, and fishing. My family was out in the wild world every chance we had. And before I moved to Utah and met David, I lived in Wyoming, and our dad took us to Yellowstone on a regular basis. I was used to seeing bears, elk, moose, you name it. I knew all the regulars of the woods. I didn't have David Scout training, but I was comfortable and content out there. Okay, back to the story. We were picking berries, eating some, and putting some in the buckets, just steadily working our way along a trail that we had not hiked yet. The entire time we were out there, our heads were on swivels, and the further we got, the worse our anxiety seemed to get. So after a few hours, we decided that we had enough berries to show a real effort was made, and we headed back. It was again an unspoken but simultaneous action that we were both suddenly spooked and knew we shouldn't have been where we were. It was like we just crossed a no trespassing sign or something. 1 minute we were cautious and alert, but having fun. The next, it was urgent that we leave the area. All in all, we had enough berries for 1 pie. We had picked enough for more than 1 pie, but our snacking on the sweet goodness of wild berries definitely dwindled down our haul. So Grandma made do, and we stayed indoors all that afternoon and night and the next morning. It wasn't until I got restless the next afternoon that I finally went back outside. I begged David to go with me, but he just wanted to watch Nickelodeon. So I grabbed my cap gun and went out on the back steps in plain view of most of the tree line. I sat there a while, playing with a few of the earlier mentioned kittens. I was just enjoying the afternoon sun and the cool breeze. All of a sudden, the mama cat got anxious and called all of her kittens back under the house where they were seeming to live, and they disappeared rather quickly, too, and they wouldn't come back out for anything. After a while, I gave up and sat there disappointed, just playing with my cap gun and trying to load it. And then the breeze shifted, and I nearly puked. The smell. Oh, God, I can still smell it to this day. It was all dirty pet cages, stinky, rotten dumpster juice, and wet dog all mixed together in the worst-smelling concoction that would make me think a skunk was a dozen roses by comparison. I gagged involuntarily, and then every hair, head to toe, stood on end, and a shock went down my spine. It was like a red alert had just went off in my brain. Slowly, I looked up at the tree line, and there, peeking out of the trees and straight out of myth and legends, in broad daylight, was the big man himself. He had to be between 8 and 9 feet tall. His shoulders were extremely wide, with a huge, thick chest, and his head was cone-shaped with a sagittal crest like a gorilla. His neck was broad and thick, giving the impression it was barely there, but it was. The sides of his large head had ears like us, and his face, well, it was truly surreal to see. His eyes looked black at that distance. They were large and deep-set, and his brow was thick like a gorilla. But his nose was broad and flat. It was like a human with large nostrils. His mouth was very wide, and his overall expression seemed confused or curious. He was completely covered in reddish-brown hair, except for the face, chest, and hands. Yes, I saw his hand. He had actually pushed down a branch of a small tree to better see me. He pushed it down so far I could see mid-chest to the top of his head with an unobstructed view. His hand could have closed around a basketball with ease. It was so wide, with enormous fingers. We just sat there, eyes locked, straight into each other. I swear that stare was intense enough that we should have seen into each other's souls. I think in real time, the staring contest was maybe a few minutes, but it felt like hours. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound or even think. There was just me and Bigfoot. Bigfoot and me. Then suddenly there was a sharp snap cracking through the air, and it broke our staring match and caused us to blink and turn away from each other. You see, my finger or hand had twitched or flinched from my panic, and it actually set off that cap gun in my hand. That little snapping noise broke the trance, and I dashed for the back door of the house. Although, when I opened the screen door, I realized Bigfoot was running away from me and up the mountain through the trees. He was as startled as I was. As I watched him disappear, I thought, Shannon, you dummy, you saw Bigfoot and you scared him away. And at the same time, I thought, holy crap, that was the scariest moment ever. So yeah, I got into a staring contest with Bigfoot, and I think it was a draw. When I did get in the house, I immediately told David and his family. Now, his grandmother believed me, but he thought I was just trying to scare him, and his parents, they thought I mistook a bear for Bigfoot. Our last 2 days were less interesting and I didn't feel watched anymore, so we actually enjoyed those 2 days to the fullest. All the while, of course, keeping our eyes on the tree line at all times. David went back a few years later, and his uncle had actually noticed strange things up there since our visit. And after walking the property and the area, he and his uncle had found tracks and other signs of Bigfoot. That's when he called me and he told me he believed me and that he was sorry for not doing so sooner. To this day, I know what I saw. I know people may or may not believe me, and that's okay. Because it just means that there's a Bigfoot out there who knows what he saw, and his fellow Big Feet may or may not believe him either. Either way, I'm not the only one with a true crazy story to tell. So share my encounter if you want, and I sincerely hope that you will. And keep on doing what you do, my dear, because me and the squad will be listening. Sorry it was so long. Signed, Shannon.